Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the shadowy cobblestone streets of medieval Europe, where the air hangs thick with incense, fear, and the unmistakable metallic scent of approaching death. You can almost hear the leather creaking as a tall, ominous figure emerges from the morning mist, a plague doctor, that iconic bird-beaked silhouette that has haunted our collective nightmares for centuries. But here's the thing. You probably won't survive 5 minutes in their world without catching something far worse than whatever's keeping you awake tonight. These weren't just medieval cosplayers with a flair for the dramatic. These were the emergency responders of the Black Death, walking into situations so horrific that modern hazmat teams would probably call in sick. Tonight, we're diving deep into their secret world, the after-hours reality that history books conveniently skip over. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how this community spans the globe, from midnight insomniacs in Tokyo to early morning commuters in London. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in the year 1348, and the world as you know it is ending. Not with nuclear fire or climate catastrophe, but with something far more intimate and terrifying. A disease that turns your own body against you. The Black Death has arrived in Europe, carried on the backs of fleas that hitched rides with merchant ships from the east. Within months, it will kill between 75 and 200 million people, roughly 30 to 60% of Europe's entire population. But you're not just any medieval peasant cowering in your hovel tonight. You're about to witness something extraordinary. The birth of one of history's most misunderstood professions. The plague doctor is emerging from necessity, desperation, and a healthy dose of medieval ingenuity that would make modern PPE manufacturers weep with envy. Picture this. You're a physician in 14th century France, and the local authorities have just offered you a contract that's equal parts lucrative and suicidal. They want you to treat plague victims, not just the wealthy merchants who can afford private care, but everyone. The poor, the dying, the already dead, but still walking. Your payment? A generous salary, free room and board, and the almost certain guarantee that you'll be dead within the month. Most doctors, quite sensibly, declined. They packed their bags, cited urgent business in distant relatives' homes, and basically noped out of the entire situation. But a few, whether driven by genuine compassion, desperate poverty, or what we might charitably call professional curiosity, said yes. These brave souls became the first plague doctors, and they immediately faced a problem that would make. Modern medical ethics committees have collective aneurysms. How do you treat a disease that kills almost everyone it touches, when you have absolutely no idea what causes it, how it spreads, or how to cure it? The answer, as you'll discover tonight, involved a fascinating blend of genuine medical knowledge, complete superstition, and the kind of creative problem-solving that only emerges when you're literally staring death in the face every single day. Historians still argue whether the iconic plague Doctor costume was primarily protective equipment or psychological warfare. The truth, as usual, is probably somewhere in between and far more interesting than either extreme would suggest. You see, the plague doctor's outfit wasn't just thrown together by some medieval costume designer having a particularly goth day. Every single piece served a specific purpose based on the medical understanding of the time. The long black robe? It was made of waxed leather or heavy canvas, designed to prevent the miasma, the bad air that medieval physicians believed carried disease, from penetrating to the skin. The famous beak? That wasn't just for show. It was stuffed with aromatic herbs, spices, and sometimes precious stones that were believed to purify the air before it reached the doctor's lungs. Think of it as a medieval air filter, except instead of HEPA technology, they used lavender, rosemary, and the occasional crushed pearl. Did it work? Well, considering that germ theory wouldn't be discovered for another 500 years, it's honestly impressive that they got as close as they did. But here's where things get really interesting, and where the secret nightlife part of our story begins to emerge. Because what the history books don't usually tell you is what these doctors did. When the sun went down and the official city contracts ended, during the day, plague doctors made their rounds like medieval Ubers of death, moving from house to house, examining patients and providing what comfort they could. They carried long wooden sticks to examine patients without touching them directly, and they documented everything in meticulous detail. But when darkness fell, the real work began. You're following Dr. Malpractice. Okay, that's not his real name, but given what you're about to witness, it might as well be through the narrow streets of Avignon in 1348. The official papal city has become a charnel house with bodies stacked like cordwood in every available space. The Pope himself has fled to his summer residence, leaving behind a skeleton crew of clergy and a handful of plague doctors. Still brave enough to work. Doctor Malpractice moves differently at night. Gone is the measured, professional gait of his daytime rounds. Instead, he's moving with purpose toward the city's outskirts, where the abandoned houses cluster like broken teeth against the horizon. Because here's the thing about plague doctors that medieval authorities preferred not to advertise. They were also the closest thing the 14th century had to forensic investigators. Every night, under cover of darkness, they conducted what we would now recognize as autopsies. Not the sanitized, clinical procedures you see on modern medical dramas, but desperate, improvised attempts to understand what was killing everyone they tried to save. These weren't officially sanctioned activities. The church had very specific rules about desecrating corpses, and cutting open plague victims definitely fell into that category. But plague doctors had a unique advantage. They were already considered contaminated by their association with the disease. They were living outside normal society anyway. So what was a little unofficial medical research between friends and the Grim Reaper? You watch as Dr. Malpractice produces a set of tools that would make a modern surgeon weep, not with admiration, but with horror. Medieval surgical instruments were essentially weaponized kitchen utensils. and performing an autopsy with them was like trying to perform brain surgery with a butter knife and a lot of optimism. But these doctors persisted, night after night, cutting open corpses by candlelight and trying to map the geography of death. They documented swollen lymph nodes, blackened extremities, and the horrific internal damage that the plague wreaked on human bodies. They were essentially conducting the world's first epidemiological study, except instead of peer review, they had to worry about being burned as heretics if anyone caught them. The quirky part? Some plague doctors developed what we might call professional superstitions around their nighttime work. Dr. Malpractice, for instance, always carried a small mirror in his left pocket, believing that it would reflect any evil spirits trying to possess him while he worked with the dead. Another doctor in nearby Marseille insisted on wearing his underwear inside out during autopsies, convinced that this would confuse any demons trying to track his scent. These weren't just random quirks. They were coping mechanisms developed by people working under unimaginable stress. When you're spending your days watching people die, and your nights cutting them open to figure out why, you develop whatever rituals help you maintain your sanity. The mainstream historical fact that most people know is that plague doctors wore those distinctive costumes for protection. What's less well known is that many of them also served as unofficial coroners, tax collectors, and even executioners when the regular city officials either died or fled. But the real secret of their nightlife wasn't just the unauthorized autopsies. It was the networks they built with each other, an underground community of medical professionals who shared information, techniques, and probably more than a few drinks while trying to make sense of the apocalypse happening around them. You're crouched in the shadows of a crumbling monastery outside Florence, watching as three plague doctors converge on what looks like a medieval medical conference. Except instead of PowerPoint presentations and complimentary coffee, they're sharing hand-drawn anatomical sketches by torchlight and passing around a bottle of something that smells like it could strip paint off a cathedral. This is the part of plague doctor history that reads like a medieval medical thriller. Because while the official story focuses on their individual heroism and dedication, the reality is that these doctors quickly realized they needed each other to survive, both professionally and literally. Dr. Malpractice nods to his colleagues. Dr. Nightshade from Pisa and Dr. Bloodletting from Siena. Yes, these are the names I'm giving them, because their real names have been lost to history. And honestly, given what they're about to discuss, these pseudonyms are probably more accurate. Anyway, the humors are completely unbalanced, Dr. Nightshade is saying, unrolling a piece of parchment covered in what looks like a cross between a medical diagram and a treasure map, but not in any pattern we've seen before. You see, medieval medicine was based on the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Every disease was supposedly caused by an imbalance of these bodily fluids, and treatment involved restoring the proper balance through various methods that ranged from sensible rest and good nutrition to absolutely terrifying bloodletting and mercury poisoning. Closing parenthesis dot. The plague broke all the rules. Patients would present with symptoms that suggested an excess of black bile. The melancholic humor associated with depression and death, but treatments that should have worked for Black. Bile disorders made them worse. It was like trying to fix a computer virus with a hammer. Theoretically logical, according to your understanding of the system, but practically useless and potentially destructive. These nighttime gatherings became crucial for sharing information that couldn't be discussed during official rounds. During the day, plague doctors had to maintain the fiction that they understood what they were dealing with. Patients and their families needed to believe that medical science had answers, even when those answers were essentially medieval versions of, "Have you tried turning it off and on again?" But at night, away from the desperate eyes of the dying and their loved ones, these doctors could admit what they really knew. Absolutely nothing. I tried the mercury treatment on the baker's wife. Dr. Bloodletting reports, taking a swig from the bottle that's making its rounds. Same result as always. She died, but at least she died with properly balanced humors. This was gallows humor at its finest, but it served a crucial psychological function. These doctors were dealing with a mortality rate that would make modern emergency room physicians quit medicine and become accountants. They needed ways to process the constant failure, the endless death, and the growing realization that everything they'd been taught about medicine was essentially useless against this particular enemy. The quirky tidbit that historians love to mention is that plague doctors often carried plague stones, special rocks that were supposed to absorb the disease from patients' bodies. What they don't usually mention is that many doctors collected these stones obsessively, carrying dozens of them in special pouches and trading them with each other like medieval Pokemon cards. Dr. Malpractice produces his collection. A smooth river stone from the Rhine, supposedly effective against bubonic symptoms. A piece of volcanic glass from Sicily for pneumonic plague. And his prized possession, a meteorite fragment that he claims can cure any form of the disease. The other doctors examine these treasures with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious relics, because in a way, that's exactly what they were. Historians still argue whether these informal medical networks actually improved treatment outcomes or simply provided psychological support for overwhelmed physicians. The evidence suggests both, which makes sense when you consider that medieval medicine was as much about maintaining hope as it was about actual healing. But these nighttime meetings weren't just support groups for traumatized doctors. They were also where the real medical innovation happened. Away from the constraints of official medical doctrine and church oversight, plague doctors could experiment with treatments that would have been considered heretical during daylight. Hours. You watch as Dr. Nightshade unwraps a small package containing what looks like moldy bread. "I've been feeding this to patients," she explains. "The ones who eat it seem to last longer than the ones who don't." She's accidentally discovered penicillin roughly 600 years before Alexander Fleming will get credit for it. Of course, she has no idea why moldy bread might help. Her theory involves something about the bread absorbing evil humors from the air, but the empirical observation is correct. This is the secret that makes plague doctor history so fascinating. They were conducting legitimate medical research using completely wrong theoretical frameworks. They were like scientists trying to understand quantum physics using ancient Greek philosophy. Occasionally, they stumbled onto something useful, but usually for entirely the wrong reasons. Dr. Bloodletting shares his own discovery. Patients who are kept warm and given plenty of fluids seem to survive longer than those treated with traditional cooling methods. Again, he's accidentally identified supportive care as a crucial component of treatment, but he attributes the success to maintaining the proper balance of hot and cold humors. The mainstream historical fact is that plague doctors had a mortality rate almost as high as their patients, somewhere between 60 and 80% of practicing plague doctors died within the first year of the pandemic. What's less well known is that the doctors who survived were often the ones who participated in these informal knowledge-sharing networks. But the most closely guarded secret of these nighttime gatherings wasn't medical at all. It was financial. You see, plague doctors were some of the highest paid professionals in medieval Europe, but they were also some of the most likely to die before they could spend their earnings. This created a unique economic situation. A group of people with significant disposable income and very short life expectancies. The solution they developed was essentially medieval life insurance, except instead of insurance companies, they had each other. Dr. Malpractice pulls out a leather-bound ledger that looks like a cross between an accounting book and a last will and testament. If I die before the next new moon, he explains, my salary goes to Dr. Nightshade to support her research. If she dies first, her equipment goes to Dr. Bloodletting, and her money goes to the monastery to care for plague orphans. These informal financial networks allowed plague doctors to pool their resources for medical research, support each other's families, and fund charitable works that wouldn't have been possible individually. They were essentially creating the world's first medical research grants, funded by doctors who knew they probably wouldn't live to see the results. The bottle makes another round, and the conversation turns to what modern readers would recognize as early epidemiology. These doctors were tracking the spread of the disease across Europe, mapping its progression from city to city, and trying to identify patterns that might help predict where it would strike next. It follows the trade routes, Dr. Nightshade observes, tracing a finger across a hand-drawn map of Europe, but not always. Sometimes it jumps, like it has wings. She's describing what we now know as the difference between bubonic plague, spread by fleas on rats, following trade routes, and pneumonic plague, spread by respiratory droplets, which can indeed seem to jump across geographic barriers. But to medieval observers, this looked like evidence that the disease was supernatural in origin. This is where the plague doctor's nighttime activities took on an almost mystical quality. Unable to explain the disease through conventional medical theory, some of them began developing what we might charitably call alternative hypotheses. You're now deeper into the night, and the conversation around the flickering torches has taken a decidedly esoteric turn. Dr. Malpractice is consulting what appears to be a combination medical text and astrological chart, while Dr. Bloodletting is arranging small bones and patterns that would make a modern forensic anthropologist very uncomfortable. This is where plague doctor history gets genuinely weird, and where the line between medicine and magic becomes so blurred that you need a medieval GPs to navigate it. The conjunction of Mars and Saturn in the House of Death. Dr. Malpractice mutters, squinting at his charts. It explains why the Mercury treatments aren't working during the third quarter moon. Now, before you start rolling your eyes at medieval superstition, remember that these doctors were working with the best scientific knowledge available to them. Astrology wasn't considered pseudoscience in the 14th century. It was an integral part of medical practice. As respectable as pharmacology is today, medieval physicians believed that the human body was connected to the movements of celestial bodies, and that effective treatment required understanding these cosmic influences. A doctor who ignored astrology was like a modern physician who ignored blood pressure readings technically possible, but professionally irresponsible. The quirky part is that some plague doctors developed incredibly sophisticated astrological systems specifically for plague treatment. They tracked not just the major planetary movements, but also the phases of the moon, the positions of minor asteroids, and even the appearance of comets. Dr. Nightshade has developed a chart that correlates patient survival rates with the position of Venus, and she's convinced she's discovered a pattern. Patients treated during Venus retrograde have a 23% higher survival rate. She explains, showing her colleagues a parchment covered in tiny marks. But only if they're also given the moldy bread treatment and kept facing east during the crisis phase. This sounds completely ridiculous until you realize that she's essentially conducting the world's first clinical trial. She's tracking variables, measuring outcomes, and adjusting treatments based on observed results. The fact that some of her variables happen to be astrological doesn't invalidate the methodology. It just reflects the scientific paradigm of her time. Historians still argue whether medieval medical astrology was pure superstition or a primitive form of statistical analysis. The truth is probably that it was both a way of organizing observations about treatment, outcomes using the conceptual framework available to medieval minds. But the real secret of these nighttime gatherings wasn't the astrology, it was the alchemy. Because while the official medical establishment was focused on balancing humors and consulting star charts, some plague doctors were conducting what we would now recognize as early chemistry experiments. Dr. Bloodletting produces a small glass vial filled with a liquid that seems to glow with its own inner light. Aqua Vita, he announces proudly, but not the kind they sell in taverns. You're looking at medieval moonshine, except instead of getting drunk, this particular batch is designed to cure the plague. Dr. Bloodletting has been experimenting with distillation techniques, trying to extract the essence of various medicinal herbs and combine them in ways that amplify their healing properties. The mainstream historical fact is that many plague doctors were also alchemists, but what's less well known is the sophistication of their experimental methods. These weren't just random mixtures thrown together by desperate men. They were systematic attempts to understand the chemical properties of natural substances. Dr. Bloodletting's Aqua Vita contains extracts from willow bark, which contains salicin, a precursor to aspirin, foxglove digitalis, still used for heart conditions, and several other plants that modern pharmacology recognizes as medically active. He doesn't understand the biochemical mechanisms, but he's identified through trial and error that certain combinations seem to help patients more than others. The secret, he explains, is the order of distillation. You have to extract the lunar essence first, then the solar, then combine them during the hour of Mercury. This sounds like complete nonsense until you realize that he's describing a specific sequence of chemical extractions performed at different temperatures and times of day. The astrological language is just his way of encoding what are essentially laboratory protocols. The other doctors lean in as he demonstrates his technique. This isn't just medical curiosity, it's intellectual survival. These men are watching their patients die despite their best efforts, and they're desperate for anything that might tip the odds in favor of life. You watch as Dr. Nightshade takes careful notes, sketching the apparatus and recording the exact procedures. This information will be shared with other plague doctors across Europe through a network that operates entirely outside official medical channels. Because here's another secret that history books tend to gloss over. Plague doctors developed their own communication system, a kind of medieval medical internet that allowed them to share discoveries and techniques across vast distances. They used a combination of coded letters, traveling merchants, and even carrier pigeons to pass information between cities. A breakthrough in Florence could reach Paris within weeks, and a new treatment developed in London might be tested in Prague before the month was out. The codes they used were necessary because much of what they were doing was technically illegal. The church had strict rules about medical practice, and experimenting with alchemy was dangerously close to practicing magic. Getting caught could result in anything from excommunication to being burned at the stake, depending on who was doing the catching and what kind of mood they were in. Doctor Malpractice produces a letter that arrived earlier that day, carried by a merchant traveling from Venice. The text appears to be a routine update about grain prices and shipping schedules, but hidden within the commercial language is a detailed description of a new plague treatment involving heated mercury vapor. Brother Giovanni reports excellent harvest this season. Dr. Malpractice reads aloud. The wheat yields have increased by 30% when the fields are treated with the special silver fertilizer during the dark moon. Translated from merchant speak to medical speak, this means that a doctor in Venice has achieved a 30% improvement in patient survival rates using mercury vapor treatments administered during specific lunar phases. The other doctors exchange glances. 30% is huge. The difference between watching 9 out of 10 patients die versus watching 7 out of 10 patients die. In a profession where success is measured in tiny increments of reduced mortality, this kind of improvement is revolutionary. But there's a catch, and Dr. Nightshade is the first to voice it. Mercury vapor? That's going to kill the doctors faster than the plague. She's absolutely right. Mercury poisoning was a well-known occupational hazard for alchemists and metalworkers. The symptoms, tremors, memory loss, kidney damage, and eventual death or familiar to anyone who worked with the substance regularly. This is the dark side of plague doctor innovation, the willingness to experiment on themselves as well as their patients. These men were so desperate to find effective treatments that they were willing to risk their own lives, testing substances and procedures that might or might not work. The conversation that follows is a fascinating glimpse into medieval medical ethics. How do you weigh the potential benefits of a treatment against its known risks? How do you decide whether to try an experimental procedure on a dying patient when you know it might kill them faster than the disease? These are questions that modern medical ethics committees spend months debating, but plague doctors had to make these decisions in real time, often with incomplete information and under enormous pressure. Dr. Bloodletting suggests a compromise. They'll test the mercury vapor treatment on doctors who are already showing early symptoms of plague infection. If it works, they'll know it's worth the risk. If it doesn't, well, they were probably going to die anyway. This sounds callous until you remember the context. These are men who have been watching people die horribly for months, who have tried every conventional treatment available and seen them all fail. They're not being reckless, they're being systematic about their desperation. The decision to test experimental treatments on themselves rather than on healthy patients reflects a kind of medical ethics that's both more primitive and more sophisticated than modern standards. Primitive because it lacks the formal oversight and informed consent procedures we take for granted today, but sophisticated because it places the burden of risk on the medical professionals rather than on their patients. You're witnessing something that won't be formally recognized by medical science for another 600 years. The first clinical trial protocols. Dr. Nightshade has produced a piece of parchment divided into columns, and she's methodically recording everything about the proposed mercury vapor experiment. Subject characteristics, she mutters, writing in the careful script of someone who learned to read and write when books were still chained to library shelves. Age, sex, time since first symptoms, previous treatments attempted, astrological. Sign ... double quotes, wait, astrological sign? Before you dismiss this as medieval nonsense, consider that she's trying to control for variables that might affect treatment outcomes. The fact that she includes astrological data alongside medical symptoms just reflects the integrated worldview of her time. She's not being unscientific. She's being comprehensive according to 14th century standards, the mainstream historical fact that most people know is that medieval medicine was primitive and superstitious. What's less well known is that medieval physicians were often remarkably systematic in their approach to treatment and record keeping. They just used different theoretical frameworks than we do today. Dr. Malpractice volunteers to be the first. Test subject. He's been showing early symptoms for 3 days: swollen lymph nodes, fever, and the characteristic headaches that mark the beginning of bubonic plague. Under normal circumstances, he has maybe a week to live. If this works, he says with the kind of gallows humor that seems to be a professional requirement for plague doctors, I'll live long enough to die of mercury poisoning instead. If it doesn't work, well, at least we'll know. The apparatus they construct for the mercury vapor treatment looks like something from a medieval chemistry set designed by someone who learned engineering from illuminated manuscripts. It involves a series of glass vessels, copper tubes, and a heating system that uses charcoal and a lot of prayer to maintain consistent temperatures. Dr. Bloodletting, who designed the contraption, explains the theory behind it. Mercury was considered the most perfect of metals in medieval alchemy. It was liquid like water, but metallic like gold, hot like fire, but cool like air. It embodied all the contradictions that made it theoretically perfect for treating a disease that seemed to break all the normal rules of medicine. The idea was that mercury vapor would penetrate the patient's body and bind with the corrupt humors that caused plague symptoms, neutralizing them through a kind of alchemical reaction. It's complete nonsense from a modern biochemical perspective, but it's internally consistent, according to medieval medical theory. What they don't realize is that they're accidentally stumbling towards something that might actually work, albeit for completely different reasons than they think. Mercury compounds do have antimicrobial properties, and while mercury vapor is incredibly toxic to humans, it's also toxic to bacteria. They're essentially attempting the world's first antibiotic treatment, except they're using a substance that's almost as dangerous to the patient as it is to the pathogen. The quirky detail that historians love to mention is that plague doctors often named their experimental apparatus. Dr. Bloodletting's mercury vapor device is called the Breath of Hermes, after the Roman god associated with alchemy and medicine. Other doctors had equally creative names for their equipment. The Tears of Venus for a distillation apparatus, the Sword of Mars for a particularly aggressive bloodletting device. These weren't just whimsical nicknames they were part of. A systematic approach to organizing and remembering complex procedures. In an era before printed manuals or standardized equipment, giving your tools memorable names was a practical way to ensure that techniques could be passed down accurately from one practitioner to another. You watch as Dr. Malpractice positions himself over the vapor apparatus, breathing in the metallic fumes that rise from the heated mercury. The other doctors monitor him carefully, noting changes in his breathing, skin color, and general demeanor. Within minutes, it's clear that something is happening. Dr. Malpractice's fever seems to be breaking, and the swelling in his lymph nodes appears to be reducing. But he's also showing signs of mercury poisoning, tremors in his hands, difficulty speaking clearly, and a metallic taste in his mouth that he describes as like licking a sword. This is the moment when medieval medicine becomes genuinely tragic. They've possibly discovered something that could help plague patients, but they lack the knowledge to use it safely. It's like finding the cure for cancer, but not knowing about radiation dosage. The treatment might work, but it could easily kill you in the process. Historians still argue whether any of the experimental treatments developed by plague doctors actually improved patient outcomes or simply provided the illusion of medical progress. The evidence is mixed, partly because medieval record keeping wasn't designed to track the kind of statistical data that modern medicine requires. But what's not in dispute is that these nighttime experiments represented a fundamental shift in medical thinking. For the first time in European history, physicians were systematically testing new treatments and sharing their results with colleagues across international boundaries. Dr. Nightshade continues her meticulous documentation, noting not just doctor malpractice's symptoms, but also environmental factors, the temperature of the room, the phase of the moon, the direction of the wind. She's trying to identify every variable that might affect the treatment's success or failure. The vapor must be inhaled for exactly 13 breaths, she writes, during the hour of Mercury, while facing east with the patient's feet elevated and his head aligned with the constellation of the physician. This sounds like an elaborate ritual, but it's actually a precise protocol designed to ensure reproducible results. The astrological and directional elements aren't just superstition. They're ways of standardizing treatment. Conditions in an era before thermometers, clocks, and other measuring devices. The 13 breaths specification is particularly interesting because it suggests that the doctors have already experimented with different dosages and found that this particular amount produces the best balance between therapeutic effect and toxic side effects. As the night progresses, Dr. Malpractice's condition continues to improve, but so do his symptoms of mercury poisoning. By dawn, it's clear that the treatment is both working and killing him, just at different rates. This becomes the central dilemma of plague. Doctor innovation. How do you develop effective treatments when you don't understand the underlying mechanisms of either the disease or the cure? It's like trying to perform surgery while blindfolded, using tools you've never seen before, on a patient whose anatomy is completely unfamiliar. The solution they develop is essentially medieval quality control. Dr. Bloodletting suggests modifying the apparatus to reduce the concentration of mercury vapor, while Dr. Nightshade proposes limiting the treatment sessions to shorter durations. Perhaps 7 breaths instead of 13, she suggests, and only during the waxing moon, when the body's natural healing powers are strongest. They're essentially conducting dose-response studies using trial and error, guided by astrological theory and a lot of hope. It's primitive by modern standards, but it's also remarkably systematic given the constraints they're working under. The conversation turns to documentation and communication. How do they share these findings with other plague doctors without revealing the illegal nature of their experiments? How do they encode treatment protocols in ways that will be understood by colleagues, but not by church authorities? Dr. Malpractice, despite his mercury-induced tremors, produces a piece of parchment and begins writing what appears to be a recipe for bread. But hidden within the instructions for mixing flour and yeast are precise directions for constructing and operating the mercury vapor apparatus. To achieve the proper rise, he writes, the dough must be exposed to metallic vapors for the duration of 7 prayers, while the baker faces the morning star and maintains the sacred temperature through careful attention to the celestial fires. It's a masterpiece of medieval coding detailed enough for a trained alchemist to reconstruct the procedure, but vague enough to pass as harmless baking instructions if intercepted by the wrong authorities. You're now watching the birth of what historians would later call underground medical literature, a secret network of knowledge, sharing that operated parallel to official medical institutions. Dr. Nightshade has produced a collection of similar recipes and merchant letters that contain encoded medical information from plague doctors across Europe. There's a wine merchant's guide from Prague that's actually a detailed description of herbal treatments for plague symptoms. A textile trader's inventory from London contains specifications for improved protective clothing. A grain farmer's almanac from Paris includes what appears to be the first systematic study of plague transmission patterns. This clandestine medical literature represents one of the most fascinating aspects of plague doctor culture, their ability to innovate and communicate despite operating outside the established medical hierarchy. They were essentially creating the world's first peer-reviewed medical journals, except instead of academic publishers, they had bakers, merchants, and traveling monks serving as their distribution network. The mainstream historical fact is that the Black Death killed between 75 and 200 million people in Europe. What's less well known is that it also accelerated medical innovation by forcing physicians to experiment with treatments and techniques that would never have been attempted under normal circumstances. Dr. Malpractice's mercury vapor experiment is just one example of the kind of desperate innovation that characterized plague medicine. Other doctors were experimenting with everything from controlled bloodletting to surgical drainage of buboes to early forms of quarantine and isolation. Some of these experiments were genuinely helpful. The practice of isolating plague patients, for instance, did reduce transmission rates, even though the doctors who implemented it didn't understand the germ theory of disease. They thought they were preventing the spread of corrupted air, but the practical effect was the same as modern infection control measures. Other experiments were spectacularly dangerous. There are records of plague doctors attempting to treat patients with controlled doses of various poisons, based on the theory that, like if the plague was caused by corruption in the body, then introducing controlled corruption might stimulate the body's natural defenses. A quirky detail that medical historians love to discuss is the plague doctor's obsession with timing. Everything had to be done at precisely the right moment, not just the right time of day, but the right phase of the moon, the right astrological conjunction, the right season of the year. This wasn't just superstition. It was an attempt to control variables in an era before scientific instruments. If you can't measure temperature, humidity, or atmospheric pressure, then tracking celestial movements becomes a way of standardizing experimental conditions. Dr. Nightshade has developed what she calls the physician's calendar, a complex chart that correlates optimal treatment times with astronomical events. According to her calculations, mercury vapor treatments are most effective when administered during the third hour after sunset, on nights when Venus is visible in the eastern sky, during the waning moon. The celestial influences are strongest then, she explains, showing her colleagues a parchment covered with intricate diagrams. The patient's natural healing energies are aligned with the therapeutic properties of the mercury. This sounds like complete mysticism until you realize that she's essentially describing circadian rhythms, and environmental factors that modern medicine recognizes as important for treatment outcomes. The fact that she's using astrological language doesn't invalidate her observations. It just reflects the conceptual framework available to medieval minds. Historians still argue whether medieval medical astrology was based on genuine observations of treatment outcomes or simply on theoretical speculation. The evidence suggests it was probably a combination of both careful empirical observation filtered through astrological theory, which was the closest thing to statistical analysis available in the 14th century. But the real breakthrough of that night isn't the mercury vapor treatment, it's the realization that they need to systematize their approach to medical experimentation. Dr. Bloodletting suggests creating what he calls the Physicians' Guild of the Night, a formal but secret organization dedicated to sharing experimental treatments and research findings. We need protocols, he argues, his words slightly slurred. From the mercury exposure he's been breathing while monitoring Dr. Malpractice's treatment, standards, ways to ensure that what works in Florence will also work in Paris. This is a revolutionary concept from medieval medicine, which was traditionally based on individual master-apprentice relationships and closely guarded trade secrets. The idea of openly sharing medical knowledge, even within a secret organization, goes against centuries of professional tradition. But the plague has changed everything. The old system of medical education and practice has essentially collapsed. Most of the established physicians are dead or have fled, leaving behind a handful of desperate survivors who are willing to try anything that might save lives. You watch as they draft what amounts to the world's first medical research charter. It's written on parchment that Dr. Nightshade has treated with a special preparation that makes it nearly invisible unless heated over a candle flame. Medieval, invisible. Ink made from a combination of lemon juice and alchemical compounds. The charter establishes protocols for conducting experiments, standards for documenting results, and procedures for sharing information across the network. It also includes what we would now recognize as ethical guidelines for human experimentation. No treatment shall be attempted on a patient without first being tested on a physician who volunteers for the procedure. Reads one clause. No experimental procedure shall be performed without the knowledge and consent of the patient or their family. No physician shall claim exclusive ownership of any treatment that proves effective against the plague. These are remarkably advanced ethical principles for the 14th century, reflecting a level of moral sophistication that challenges common assumptions about medieval medicine. These doctors may have been working with primitive tools and flawed theories, but they were grappling with ethical questions that remain relevant to modern medical research. The quirky aspect of their charter is that it's written entirely in alchemical symbols and astrological notation, making it completely incomprehensible to anyone who isn't trained in both medicine and occult studies. A church official examining the document would see what appears to be an elaborate horoscope or magical spell, not a sophisticated medical research protocol. Dr. Malpractice, despite his ongoing mercury poisoning symptoms, insists on adding a clause about financial arrangements. The Guild will maintain a common treasury, funded by contributions from member physicians, to support research activities and provide for the families of doctors who die during experimental procedures. We're already risking our lives, he points out, his hands trembling as he writes. We might as well make sure our discoveries survive, even if we don't. This financial innovation is as important as the medical research protocols. By pooling their resources, plague doctors can fund experiments that would be impossible for individual practitioners to afford. They can also ensure that promising research continues even when the original investigator dies, which, given their mortality rate, is a very real concern. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval guilds were primarily economic organizations, designed to protect the interests of craftsmen and merchants. What's less well known is that some guilds, particularly those formed during crisis periods, also served as research and development organizations. The Physicians' Guild of the Night represents an early example of what we might now call a research consortium, a collaborative organization dedicated to advancing knowledge in a specific field. The fact that it operated in secret doesn't diminish its significance. If anything, it demonstrates the dedication of its members to scientific progress, despite significant personal and professional risks. As dawn approaches, the three doctors finalize their charter and begin planning the recruitment of additional members. They identify potential candidates in major cities across Europe, physicians who have shown interest in experimental treatments, who have survived long enough to demonstrate both skill and luck, and who have the intellectual flexibility to work outside established medical doctrine. The recruitment process they design is elaborate and necessarily secretive. Potential members will be approached through coded messages hidden in routine medical correspondence. Those who respond appropriately will be invited to participate in consultation sessions that are actually screening interviews for guild membership. Dr. Nightshade suggests using a system of medical riddles to identify suitable candidates. Ask them about the treatment of melancholic humors during Venus retrograde, she proposes. Anyone who gives a purely conventional answer isn't ready for our kind of work. But someone who mentions experimental approaches or questions the standard treatments might be worth recruiting. This screening process reflects the Guild's understanding that not all plague doctors are suitable for experimental research. They need physicians who are intellectually curious, willing to challenge established doctrine, and capable of working collaboratively rather than competitively. A conversation turns to long-term goals. What do they hope to accomplish beyond simply surviving the current plague outbreak? How can they ensure that the knowledge they're developing will be preserved and transmitted to future generations of physicians? Dr. Bloodletting suggests establishing permanent research centers in major cities' hidden laboratories where guild members can conduct experiments, train apprentices, and maintain libraries of medical knowledge. These centers would be disguised as other types of businesses: apothecary shops, monastery scriptoriums, even taverns or brothels, where unusual activities wouldn't attract unwanted attention. We need to think beyond this plague, he argues. There will be other diseases, other medical crises. The methods we're developing now could be applied to any condition that conventional medicine can't handle. This long-term perspective is remarkable for physicians who are living day to day in the middle of a pandemic. It suggests a level of strategic thinking that goes far beyond immediate survival concerns. Historians still argue whether the physicians' Guild of the Night actually existed as a formal organization or was simply an informal network of like-minded doctors. The evidence is necessarily fragmentary secret. Organizations don't tend to leave detailed records, but there are enough references in coded medical texts to suggest that some kind of collaborative research network did operate during the plague. You're following Dr. Nightshade through the pre-dawn streets of Florence as she makes her way to what appears to be an abandoned apothecary shop. But appearances, as you're learning, can be deceiving in the world of plague doctors. The shop's dusty windows and barred door hide one of the Guild's first experimental research centers. She produces a key that looks like it was forged by someone who learned metalworking from alchemical texts. It's covered with symbols that serve both decorative and functional purposes. The lock mechanism is designed so that it can only be opened by someone who understands the astrological significance of the key's orientation. Inside, the shop has been transformed into something that would make a modern research laboratory look primitive by comparison. Not because of the equipment, medieval glassware and copper apparatus can't compete with modern instruments, but because of the systematic organization and documentation protocols. Every surface is covered with carefully labeled specimens, detailed notes, and experimental apparatus arranged according to principles that blend practical efficiency with alchemical theory. There are shelves of preserved plague victims' organs, racks of distillation equipment, and tables covered with charts tracking treatment outcomes. Across dozens of variables, the mainstream historical fact is that medieval medicine was primarily theoretical, based on ancient texts rather than direct observation. What's less well known is that some medieval physicians, particularly those working during crisis periods, were remarkably empirical in their approach to research and treatment. Dr. Nightshade's laboratory represents the cutting edge of 14th century medical research. She's conducting what we would now recognize as systematic clinical trials, epidemiological studies, and even basic biochemical analysis, all using the tools and theoretical frameworks available to medieval science. The quirky detail that medical historians love to mention is that many plague doctors developed elaborate filing systems for organizing their research data. Dr. Nightshade's system is based on astrological principles. Treatments tested during fire signs are filed under red tabs, earth signs under brown tabs, air signs under yellow tabs, and water signs under blue tabs. This sounds like pure superstition until you realize that it's actually a sophisticated way of organizing information according to multiple variables simultaneously. The astrological categories correspond to different environmental conditions, patient characteristics, and treatment protocols, allowing her to quickly locate relevant data for any given experimental situation. She shows you a series of charts that track patient outcomes across various treatment combinations. One chart correlates survival rates with the timing of mercury vapor treatments. Another tracks the effectiveness of herbal remedies based on the patient's astrological sign and the phase of the moon during treatment. The patterns are becoming clear, she explains, pointing to a particularly complex diagram. Patients born under water signs respond better to cooling treatments, while fire signs need heating therapies. But only during certain lunar phases, and only if the treatment is combined with the appropriate dietary restrictions. This is medieval personalized medicine, the idea that effective treatment requires understanding not just the disease, but also the individual characteristics of each patient. It's based on astrological theory rather than genetic analysis. But the underlying principle is remarkably similar to modern approaches to precision medicine. The laboratory also contains something that wouldn't be out of place in a modern medical school. Anatomical specimens preserved in various solutions, each carefully labeled with information about the patient's symptoms, treatment history, and cause of death. Dr. Nightshade has been conducting systematic autopsies on plague victims, documenting the disease's effects on different organ systems and trying to understand the mechanisms of death. Her preserved specimens represent one of the first systematic collections of pathological anatomy in European medical history. The disease attacks differently depending on how it enters the body, she explains, showing you a series of specimens that illustrate the differences between bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic plague. The lung cases die faster, but with less suffering. The lymph node cases linger longer, but in greater pain. She's essentially discovering the different clinical presentations of plague, centuries before the bacterial cause will be identified. Her observations are remarkably accurate. Modern medical descriptions of plague symptoms closely match her detailed notes. But the most impressive aspect of her research isn't the individual observations. It's the systematic approach to data, collection, and analysis. She's developed protocols for standardizing autopsy procedures, criteria for classifying different types of plague presentation, and statistical methods for comparing treatment outcomes. Historians still argue whether medieval physicians were capable of genuine statistical analysis or simply engaged in elaborate pattern matching based on astrological principles. Dr. Nightshade's work suggests that the distinction may be less important than previously thought. Her astrological framework allows her to organize and analyze data in ways that produce genuinely useful medical insights. The laboratory's most closely guarded secret is hidden behind a false wall. It can only be opened by manipulating a series of alchemical symbols in the correct sequence. Behind the wall is Dr. Nightshade's most ambitious project, an attempt to create what she calls the universal antidote, a single treatment that could cure any form of plague, regardless of how it presents or what stage it has reached. The theoretical basis for this project is pure medieval alchemy, the idea that all diseases are caused by imbalances in the fundamental elements, and that a properly prepared remedy could restore balance, regardless of the specific nature of the imbalance. The practical approach, however, is surprisingly modern. Dr. Nightshade is systematically testing combinations of substances that have shown individual effectiveness against plague symptoms, trying to identify synergistic effects that might produce better outcomes than any single treatment. Her current formulation combines mercury vapor for its antimicrobial properties. Though she doesn't understand them in those terms, willow bark extract for fever reduction, foxglove tincture for heart support, and several other botanicals that modern pharmacology recognizes as medically active. The key is the preparation sequence, she explains, showing you a complex apparatus that looks like a cross between a chemistry set and a medieval torture device. Each component must be processed separately and combined in the proper order, under the correct celestial influences. The apparatus is actually quite sophisticated, a series of distillation columns, reaction vessels, and temperature control systems that allow for precise manipulation of chemical processes. The fact that the operating instructions are written in astrological language doesn't change the underlying chemistry. You watch as she demonstrates the preparation process, carefully monitoring temperatures, timing each step according to astronomical calculations, and documenting every detail of the procedure. It's medieval pharmaceutical manufacturing, conducted with the same attention to detail and quality control that characterizes modern drug production. The quirky aspect of her universal antidote project is that she's been testing it on herself. Not because she's infected with plague, she's managed to avoid infection despite constant exposure, but because she wants to understand the remedy's effects on healthy physiology before administering it to dying patients. I take a small dose every new moon, she explains, showing you a detailed log of her self-experimentation. So far, no adverse effects, and I seem to be more resistant to minor illnesses than before. This is remarkably sophisticated thinking about drug development and safety testing. She's essentially conducting phase 1 clinical trials on herself, establishing safety profiles before moving to efficacy testing in patient populations. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval physicians often used themselves as test subjects for experimental treatments. What's less well known is the systematic approach that some doctors took to self-experimentation, including careful documentation of dosages, effects, and long-term outcomes. Dr. Nightshade's self-experimentation logs read like modern clinical research protocols. She tracks not just obvious symptoms and side effects, but also subtle changes in energy levels, sleep patterns, digestive function, and mental clarity. She's trying to understand the remedy's effects on overall health, not just its ability to prevent or treat plague. The laboratory also contains correspondence from other guild members who are conducting similar research in their own cities. There's a letter from Prague describing experiments with heated mineral baths for plague treatment. A report from London details the use of controlled bloodletting combined with herbal therapies. A coded message from Paris describes what appears to be an early form of vaccination using material from recovered plague patients. This network of research collaboration represents one of the most advanced aspects of medieval plague medicine. These doctors are sharing detailed experimental protocols, comparing results across different patient populations, and collectively building a body of knowledge that no individual practitioner could develop alone. You're now examining what might be the most remarkable document in Dr. Nightshade's collection, a comprehensive treatment manual that synthesizes research findings from guild members across Europe. Written in the same invisible ink used for the guild charter, it represents the collective medical knowledge of dozens of plague doctors who risked their lives conducting experimental treatments. The manual is organized according to what we would now recognize as evidence-based medicine principles. Treatments are ranked according to their observed effectiveness, with detailed notes about optimal dosages, timing, patient selection criteria, and potential side effects. It's essentially the world's first clinical practice guideline for plague treatment. Category 1 treatments, Dr. Nightshade explains, turning to a section marked with red symbols, show consistent effectiveness across multiple cities and patient populations. These are our most reliable interventions. The Category 1 treatments include several approaches that modern medicine would recognize as genuinely helpful. Isolation of infected patients, supportive care with fluids and nutrition, pain management with willow bark extracts, and careful monitoring for complications. But they also include treatments that seem completely mystical. Specific combinations of herbal remedies administered according to astrological timing. Mercury vapor therapy conducted during particular lunar phases, and the elaborate dietary restrictions based on the patient's birth chart. The fascinating thing is that some of these apparently mystical treatments may have had genuine medical benefits, even though the theoretical explanations were completely wrong. The astrological timing protocols, for instance, may have inadvertently optimized treatment schedules according to circadian rhythms and other biological cycles that medieval physicians couldn't directly observe. Category 2 treatments, she continues, show promise but require further testing. These are experimental approaches that have shown positive results in some cases, but haven't been consistently replicated. The Category 2 section reads like a medieval version of investigational drug protocols. There are detailed descriptions of novel herbal combinations, innovative surgical procedures for draining buboes, and even early experiments with what appears to be primitive antibiotic therapy using moldy bread and fermented plant extracts. One particularly intriguing entry describes experiments with sympathetic treatment, the idea that substances that resemble plague symptoms might be used to cure the disease. This led to trials with various black substances to treat the characteristic blackening of extremities, bitter herbs to counteract the corrupt humors, and even powdered pearls, because their perfection was thought to counteract the disease's corruption. While the theoretical basis was nonsensical, some of these treatments may have had genuine benefits. Activated charcoal, for instance, was sometimes used as a black substance for sympathetic treatment, and it does have genuine detoxification properties that could have helped some patients. The quirky detail that medical historians find most interesting is the manual's section on physician preservation, detailed protocols for keeping plague doctors healthy enough to continue treating patients. This includes not just physical protection measures like the famous beak masks and leather robes, but also psychological and spiritual practices designed to maintain mental health under extreme stress. The physician must maintain balance in all humors. Reads one entry. Through daily meditation at sunrise, weekly purification rituals, and monthly consultations with trusted colleagues for the sharing of burdens and the renewal of purpose. This is medieval physician wellness programming, recognizing that doctors working under extreme conditions need systematic support to maintain their effectiveness. The specific practices may seem strange to modern eyes, but the underlying principle that healthcare providers need structured self-care protocols is remarkably advanced. The manual also includes what might be the first systematic discussion of medical ethics in European literature. There's an entire section devoted to questions like, when is it appropriate to try experimental treatments on dying patients? How should physicians balance their duty to individual patients against their responsibility to advance medical knowledge? What obligations do doctors have to share effective treatments with competitors? These ethical discussions are framed in religious and philosophical language rather than modern bioethical terminology, but they grapple with fundamental questions that remain relevant to contemporary medical practice. Historians still argue whether the Guild's treatment manual represents genuine medical progress or simply a more sophisticated form of medieval superstition. The evidence suggests it was probably both real advances in clinical observation and treatment protocols embedded within theoretical frameworks that we now know to be incorrect. But the manual's most remarkable feature isn't its treatment protocols, it's its approach to knowledge validation. The Guild developed systematic methods for testing the reliability of medical information, including procedures for replicating experiments, criteria for evaluating evidence quality, and protocols for resolving disagreements between researchers. When physicians disagree about treatment effectiveness, reads one section, the dispute shall be resolved through controlled trials conducted simultaneously in at least 3 different cities, with results compared according to standardized criteria. This is essentially peer review and multi-center clinical trials, conducted using medieval tools and theoretical frameworks. It represents a level of scientific sophistication that challenges common assumptions about medieval intellectual capabilities. Dr. Nightshade shows you the manual's most closely guarded section, detailed case studies of patients who survived plague infection. These aren't just success stories. They're systematic analyses of what factors might have contributed to recovery, including treatment protocols, patient characteristics, environmental conditions, and timing variables. Patient 47, she reads from one case study, male, age 32, born under the sign of Leo, infected during the waning moon of harvest season, presented with classic bubonic symptoms, but also showed signs of pneumonic involvement. Treated with category 1 protocols plus experimental mercury vapor therapy. Full recovery achieved after 23 days. The case study continues with detailed notes about every aspect of the patient's treatment and recovery, including information that seems irrelevant by modern standards: astrological data, weather conditions, dietary preferences, alongside observations that remain medically significant: symptom progression, treatment response, complications, This comprehensive approach to case documentation reflects the Guild's understanding that they didn't know which variables might be important for treatment success. Rather than making assumptions about what factors mattered, they documented everything and looked for patterns that might emerge from large data sets. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval medicine was primarily based on individual case studies and anecdotal evidence. What's less well known is that some medieval physicians, particularly those working during crisis periods, developed remarkably sophisticated approaches to systematic data collection and analysis. The manual survival case studies represent one of the first attempts in European medical history to identify prognostic factors and treatment predictors through systematic comparison of patient outcomes. The methods may seem primitive by modern standards, but the underlying approach, using data to identify patterns that can guide future treatment decisions, is fundamentally sound. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of the manual is its section on knowledge transmission, detailed protocols for training new physicians and ensuring that Guild discoveries are preserved for future generations. The Guild recognized that their experimental treatments were only valuable if they could be reliably taught to other practitioners. They developed elaborate training programs that combined theoretical instruction with hands-on apprenticeships, ensuring that new members could safely and effectively implement advanced treatment protocols. The apprentice physician must demonstrate mastery of basic humoral theory, reads one training requirement, competence in astrological calculation, proficiency in alchemical preparation techniques, and successful treatment of at least 10 plague patients under supervision before being granted full Guild membership. These training standards are remarkably rigorous, requiring years of study and practical experience before a physician could practice independently. The Guild was essentially creating the world's first medical residency program, ensuring that their advanced techniques were transmitted accurately to the next generation of practitioners. Asterisk, you're now witnessing something that won't be formally recognized by medical institutions for another 400 years. The first medical board examination. Dr. Nightshade has been joined by 2 other Guild members who are evaluating a candidate for full membership. A young physician from Genoa who has traveled to Florence specifically to demonstrate his mastery of Guild protocols. The candidate, whom we'll call Dr. Apprentice, has spent 2 years studying Guild techniques under the supervision of a member physician in Genoa. Now he must prove his competence before being granted access to the organization's most advanced experimental treatments and research findings. The examination process is elaborate and necessarily secretive. It takes place over 3 nights, with each night focusing on different aspects of Guild practice, theoretical knowledge, practical skills, and ethical judgment. Tonight is the practical skills examination, and you're watching Dr. Apprentice attempt to prepare a Category 1 treatment under the watchful eyes of his examiners. The treatment involves a complex sequence of herbal extractions, alchemical preparations, and precisely timed administrations that must be coordinated with astronomical observations. Begin with the lunar extraction, Dr. Nightshade instructs. remembering that the essence must be captured during the third hour after moonrise, when the celestial influences are properly aligned. Dr. Apprentice nods nervously and begins his preparation. He's working with a distillation apparatus that looks like it was designed by someone who learned engineering from illuminated manuscripts, but his movements are confident and precise. He's clearly spent considerable time mastering these techniques. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval medical education was primarily based on memorizing ancient texts and learning from individual masters. What's less well known is that some medieval medical organizations developed sophisticated, practical training programs that emphasized hands-on experience and competency-based evaluation. The Guild's examination process reflects a remarkably modern understanding of medical education principles. They recognize that effective medical practice requires not just theoretical knowledge, but also practical skills, clinical judgment, and ethical reasoning. Their evaluation methods are designed to assess all of these competencies. As Dr. Apprentice works, the examiners are evaluating not just his technical skills, but also his understanding of the underlying principles. They ask questions about why each step is necessary, what could go wrong at each stage, and how the procedure might be modified for different patient populations. Why do you heat the mercury to exactly this temperature? Dr. Nightshade asks, observing as he carefully adjusts the flame beneath his apparatus. Because mercury's therapeutic properties are optimized when it reaches the temperature of human blood, Dr. Apprentice replies, but heating it beyond that point converts the healing essence into toxic vapors that harm rather than help. This answer demonstrates both theoretical understanding and practical knowledge. He knows not just what to do, but why it works and what the risks are. This kind of integrated knowledge is exactly what the Guild is looking for in its members. Quirky detail that medical historians find most interesting is the Guild's use of standardized patients. Volunteers who simulate plague symptoms to allow candidates to practice diagnostic and treatment skills without risking harm to actual patients. These standardized patients are typically Guild members who have recovered from plague infection and are willing to help train new physicians. They've memorized detailed symptom presentations and can accurately simulate different stages and types of plague infection. Patient presents with fever, headache, and swollen lymph nodes in the groin. Announces one standardized patient, a recovered plague doctor from Pisa, who has volunteered for tonight's examination. Symptoms began 3 days ago and have been progressively worsening. Dr. Apprentice must now demonstrate his diagnostic skills, treatment planning abilities, and patient communication techniques. He conducts a systematic examination using the Guild's standardized protocols, asks appropriate questions about symptom history and potential exposures, and develops a treatment plan that reflects current best practices. Based on the presentation and timing, he concludes, this appears to be classic bubonic plague in the early inflammatory stage. I recommend immediate isolation, supportive care with fluids and nutrition, pain management with willow bark extract, and consideration of experimental mercury vapor therapy if the patient consents and meets the appropriate selection criteria. This diagnostic reasoning demonstrates exactly the kind of systematic thinking that the Guild values. Dr. Apprentice has considered multiple factors, weighed different treatment options, and made recommendations that balance efficacy with safety. Concerns. But the examination isn't just about medical skills, it also evaluates a candidate's understanding of Guild ethics and security protocols. Dr. Nightshade presents a series of scenarios designed to test his judgment about when and how to share Guild knowledge. A wealthy merchant offers you a substantial payment for information about Guild treatment protocols, she poses. He claims his family has been affected by plague, and he wants to assure they receive the best possible care. How do you respond? Doctor. Apprentice considers carefully before answering. I would offer to treat his family members using Guild protocols, but I would not share the specific techniques or formulations. Guild knowledge is held in trust for the benefit of all plague victims, not for the profit of individuals who can afford to pay for exclusive access. This answer demonstrates understanding of both the Guild's commitment to advancing medical knowledge and its ethical principles about equitable access to effective treatments. Historians still argue whether the Guild's examination and training processes actually improved treatment outcomes or simply created an illusion of professional competence. The evidence suggests that Guild-trained physicians did achieve better patient survival rates than their conventionally trained colleagues. Though the reasons for this success remain debated, the examination continues through the night, with Dr. Apprentice demonstrating competence in increasingly complex procedures. He successfully prepares several Category 1 treatments, shows proficiency in Guild documentation protocols, and handles a series of ethical scenarios that test his judgment. About research participation and patient consent. By dawn, it's clear that he has met the Guild standards for membership. The examiners conduct a brief private consultation, then formally welcome him into the organization with a ceremony that combines elements of medical oath-taking, alchemical initiation, and secret society induction. You are now bound by the sacred obligations of the Guild, Dr. Nightshade intones, presenting him with a ring that bears the organization's symbol, a stylized plague doctor's beak surrounded by astrological signs. To advance medical knowledge through careful observation and experimentation, to share your discoveries freely with fellow members, and to maintain the secrecy that protects our work from those who would suppress it. The initiation ceremony includes the administration of what amounts to a medieval version of the Hippocratic Oath, but with additional commitments specific to the Guild's research mission and security requirements. I swear by Apollo the physician, by Asclepius, by Hygeia and Panacea, and by all the gods and goddesses, Dr. Apprentice recites, that I will fulfill this oath and this covenant according to my ability and judgment. I will use treatment to help the sick according to my ability and judgment, but never with a view to injury and wrongdoing. The oath continues with specific commitments to Guild principles, to conduct research ethically, to share knowledge freely within the organization, to maintain confidentiality about Guild activities, and to train future physicians according to Guild standards. But the most interesting aspect of the initiation Ceremony is its emphasis on the temporary nature of secrecy. The Guild sees itself not as a permanent secret society, but as a temporary organization that will eventually make its knowledge public once the immediate crisis has passed and the political climate becomes more favorable to medical innovation. When the plague has ended and the world has returned to peace, the oath concludes, we pledge to share our discoveries openly with all physicians, that future generations might benefit from the knowledge we have gained through suffering and sacrifice. This long-term vision reflects the Guild's understanding that their work has implications beyond the immediate plague crisis. They're not just trying to save lives in the present. They're trying to advance medical knowledge in ways that will benefit future patients and physicians. The mainstream historical fact is that many medieval secret societies were primarily concerned with protecting the economic interests of their members. What's less well known is that some organizations, particularly those formed during crisis periods, were genuinely dedicated to advancing knowledge and serving the public good. You're now following the newly initiated Doctor Apprentice as he begins his first official Guild assignment, establishing a research outpost in the port city of Genoa. This isn't just a matter of setting up another laboratory. It's about creating a strategic node in the Guild's growing network of medical intelligence. Gathering Genoa's position as a major Mediterranean trading hub makes it crucial for understanding plague transmission patterns. Ships arriving from the east bring not just goods and passengers, but also new strains of disease and information about treatment. Approaches being developed in other parts of the world. Dr. Apprentice's mission is to establish relationships with ship physicians, harbor officials, and local healers who might provide early warning about new plague outbreaks or variations in disease presentation. He's essentially becoming the Guild's first epidemiological intelligence officer. The safe house he establishes looks like a typical merchant's warehouse from the outside, but the interior has been carefully designed to serve multiple functions. The ground floor operates as a legitimate spice and herb trading business, providing cover for the acquisition of medical supplies and the comings and goings of Guild members. The second floor contains living quarters for Dr. Apprentice and visiting Guild physicians, while the third floor houses a sophisticated laboratory and library. The basement, accessible only through a hidden entrance behind a false wall, contains the most sensitive research materials and communication equipment. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval merchants often served as informal intelligence networks, sharing information about political and economic conditions across Europe. What's less well known is that some medical practitioners developed similar networks for sharing information about disease outbreaks and treatment innovations. Doctor Apprentice's first task is to establish contact with the local medical community without revealing his Guild affiliation. This requires a delicate balance. He needs to demonstrate enough competence to earn respect and trust, but not so much innovation that he attracts unwanted attention from church or civil authorities. He begins by offering conventional plague treatments to local patients, carefully documenting outcomes and gradually introducing minor modifications that improve effectiveness without appearing revolutionary. It's a slow process of building credibility while subtly advancing medical practice. The quirky detail that historians find most fascinating is the ambience. Guild's use of medical missionaries, physicians who traveled between cities ostensibly for religious or commercial purposes, but actually to share guild knowledge and recruit new members. These medical missionaries operated under various covers: pilgrims visiting religious sites, merchants trading in medical supplies, scholars studying at universities, even entertainers and traveling performers. Their real mission was to identify promising physicians who might be suitable for guild membership and to disseminate guild discoveries in ways that wouldn't attract official attention. Dr. Apprentice receives his first medical missionary visitor. Within a week of establishing his Genoa outpost, the visitor appears to be a Franciscan monk traveling to Rome on monastery business. But the coded phrases he uses in casual conversation identify him as a guild member from the Paris chapter. I've heard that the harvest of healing herbs has been particularly abundant this season. The monk mentions during what appears to be idle conversation about local conditions. This seemingly innocent comment is actually a coded inquiry about recent treatment outcomes and research findings. Dr. Apprentice responds with his own coded language. Indeed, the local gardeners have discovered several new cultivation techniques that show great promise. This exchange establishes their mutual guild membership and opens the way for a more detailed discussion of medical developments. They spend the evening sharing information about new treatments, comparing patient outcomes across different cities, and discussing plans for expanding guild operations. The monk brings disturbing news from Paris. Church authorities have begun investigating reports of unnatural healing practices and heretical medical theories. Several physicians have been arrested on charges of practicing magic, and at least one has been executed for allegedly making a pact with demons to cure plague patients. This intelligence highlights the constant danger that guild members face. Their experimental approaches to medicine, combined with their use of alchemical techniques and astrological timing, make them vulnerable to charges of practicing witchcraft or heresy. We must be even more careful about maintaining our cover. Identities, the monk warns. The Inquisition has begun training investigators, specifically to identify and prosecute medical heretics. This threat forces the Guild to develop even more sophisticated security protocols. They create elaborate systems of codes and ciphers for written communication, establish procedures for quickly destroying evidence if their safe houses are discovered, and develop escape routes and hiding places for members who come under official scrutiny. But the most innovative aspect of their security measures is the development of plausible deniability protocols, ways of conducting advanced medical research. That can be explained as conventional practice if discovered by authorities. Dr. Apprentice demonstrates one such protocol, and apparently convention, a bloodletting procedure that actually involves the precise extraction and analysis of blood samples for diagnostic purposes. To casual observers, he's simply performing standard medieval medical practice, but he's actually conducting what we would now recognize as primitive laboratory testing. The key, he explains to his visitor, is to embed advanced techniques within conventional procedures. We're not abandoning traditional medicine. We're enhancing it in ways that aren't immediately obvious to outside observers. This approach allows guild members to continue their research while minimizing the risk of persecution. They're essentially conducting underground medical innovation, advancing the field through incremental improvements that fly under the radar of official scrutiny. Historians still argue whether the guild's security measures were necessary paranoia or appropriate responses to genuine threats. The evidence suggests that medieval authorities were indeed suspicious of medical innovation, particularly when it involved techniques that resembled magical practices. The monk's visit also brings news of a major guild research initiative, a systematic study of plague transmission patterns across Europe. Guild members in major cities are documenting not just local outbreak patterns, but also information about how the disease spreads between communities. We're beginning to see patterns that suggest the disease follows predictable routes. The monk reports, it seems to spread faster along major trade routes than through rural areas, and coastal cities are affected before inland communities. This epidemiological intelligence is crucial for understanding how plague spreads and potentially predicting where future outbreaks might occur. It's also information that could be valuable to civil authorities for planning purposes, but sharing it would require revealing the guild's existence and research activities. Dr. Apprentice agrees to contribute to this research project by documenting plague patterns in the Genoa region and tracking the arrival of infected ships from various Mediterranean ports. His position in a major trading hub makes him ideally situated to observe how maritime trade affects disease transmission patterns. The conversation turns to the Guild's most ambitious project yet, the development of what they call the Great Synthesis, a comprehensive medical text that will combine all of their research findings into a single authoritative guide to plague treatment and prevention. This isn't just a matter of compiling existing knowledge. It's an attempt to create a new theoretical framework for understanding disease that incorporates both traditional medical theory and the Guild's experimental discoveries. We're realizing that the old humoral theories aren't sufficient to explain what we're observing, the monk explains. The plague behaves in ways that don't fit conventional medical models. We need new theories that can account for our empirical findings. This represents a fundamental shift in medieval medical thinking, a recognition that theoretical frameworks must be modified when they conflict with observed reality. It's essentially the beginning of evidence-based medicine, conducted within the constraints of 14th century knowledge and technology. Dr. Apprentice shows his visitor the contribution he's preparing for, the Great Synthesis, a detailed analysis of how plague symptoms vary depending on the route of infection. His observations of patients infected through different pathways flee, bites, respiratory droplets, direct contact with infected materials have revealed distinct clinical patterns that weren't previously recognized. Patients infected through the lungs deteriorate much faster than those infected through the skin, he notes, showing charts that track symptom progression over time. But they also respond differently to treatment. What works for bubonic cases often fails for pneumonic cases. This clinical insight is remarkably accurate. Modern medicine recognizes that bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic plague require different treatment approaches. Dr. Apprentice has identified these distinctions through careful observation, centuries before the bacterial cause of plague will be discovered. The monk examines Dr. Apprentice's data with the kind of attention that modern peer reviewers give to submitted manuscripts. He asks detailed questions about methodology, sample sizes, and potential confounding variables. The Guild has developed sophisticated standards for evaluating medical research, ensuring that conclusions are based on solid evidence rather than wishful thinking. Your sample size is still relatively small, the monk observes, but the patterns you're identifying are consistent with observations from other cities. We're seeing similar distinctions between infection routes in Paris, London, and Prague. This kind of multi-center validation is exactly what the Guild needs to establish the reliability of their findings. They're essentially conducting the world's first meta-analysis, combining data from multiple sources to identify patterns that might not be apparent in individual studies. But the great synthesis isn't just about documenting current knowledge. It's also about establishing research priorities for the future. The Guild recognizes that their work during the current plague outbreak is laying the foundation for medical advances that might take decades or centuries to fully develop. We're not just trying to save lives today, the monk explains. We're trying to build the knowledge base that future physicians will need to handle the next medical crisis, whatever form it might take. This long-term perspective is remarkable for physicians working in the middle of a pandemic. It suggests a level of strategic thinking that goes far beyond immediate survival concerns. The quirky aspect of the Great Synthesis project is that it's being written in multiple versions simultaneously. There's a public version that uses conventional medical language and can be safely shared with non-Guild physicians. There's a Guild version that includes all of their experimental findings and advanced techniques. And there's a future version that speculates about possible medical developments based on their current research. The future version is particularly fascinating because it contains remarkably prescient insights about the direction of medical progress. Guild members are speculating about the possibility of substances that could kill disease-causing agents without harming patients, techniques for preventing infection through controlled exposure to weakened forms of disease, and methods for using the body's own healing mechanisms to fight illness. These speculations are based on their observations of natural recovery processes, the effects of various experimental treatments, and logical extrapolations from their current research findings. While they lack the theoretical frameworks to fully understand what they're observing, they're making educated guesses about future medical possibilities that turn out to be remarkably accurate. Dr. Apprentice contributes to the future version by speculating about the possibility of identifying disease-causing agents before they produce symptoms. His observations of plague transmission patterns have led him to hypothesize that the disease might be caused by invisible entities that can be detected and potentially eliminated before they cause illness. If we could identify the specific agent that causes plague, he writes, we might be able to develop treatments that target the agent directly, rather than simply managing its effects on the patient. This insight anticipates the development of germ theory and targeted antimicrobial therapy by several centuries. While Dr. Apprentice lacks the tools to test his hypothesis, his logical reasoning based on observed evidence points toward fundamental principles that will eventually revolutionize medicine. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval physicians were primarily concerned with treating symptoms rather than understanding disease causes. What's less well known is that some medieval medical researchers, particularly those working during crisis periods, developed remarkably sophisticated theories about disease causation and transmission. You're now witnessing the Guild's most dangerous operation yet, the infiltration of a major monastery that serves as both a hospital and a center of medical education. Dr. Apprentice has been tasked with gathering intelligence about official church positions on experimental medicine while simultaneously recruiting sympathetic clergy who might be willing to support Guild activities. The monastery of San Lorenzo sits on a hill overlooking Genoa's harbor, its imposing walls hiding one of Europe's most advanced medical facilities. The monks who run the hospital have access to medical texts, anatomical specimens, and patient populations that could significantly advance Guild research if they could be convinced to collaborate. But this is also the most dangerous possible environment for a Guild member. Monasteries are centers of religious orthodoxy, and any hint of heretical medical practices could result in immediate arrest and trial by the Inquisition. Dr. Apprentice's cover story is that he's a traveling physician seeking to study the monastery's famous medical library. This provides a legitimate reason for his presence, while allowing him to observe the monks' medical practices and identify potential allies. The monastery's medical practices turn out to be surprisingly advanced. The monks have developed systematic approaches to patient care that include detailed record keeping, standardized treatment protocols, and even primitive forms of infection control. Brother Thomas, the monastery's chief physician, shows Dr. Apprentice around the hospital wards with obvious pride. We found that isolating patients with similar symptoms improves outcomes for everyone, he explains, gesturing toward a ward where plague patients are separated from those with other conditions. This is exactly the kind of empirical observation that the Guild values, practical innovations based on careful observation of treatment outcomes. Dr. Apprentice realizes that the monastery's physicians are conducting their own informal medical research, even if they don't frame it in Guild terms. The challenge is determining whether Brother Thomas and his colleagues would be receptive to more systematic research collaboration, or whether they would report Guild activities to church authorities. Dr. Apprentice begins testing the waters with carefully phrased questions about medical innovation and experimental treatments. I've heard rumors of physicians who are trying new approaches to plague treatment, he mentions casually. What do you think of such efforts? Brother Thomas's response is cautiously positive. The Church teaches that we should use all available means to preserve life, he replies. If new treatments can save lives, then surely God would approve of their development. This suggests that Brother Thomas might be open to guild collaboration, but Dr. Apprentice needs to be certain before revealing any sensitive information. The quirky detail that historians find most interesting is the guild's development of theological cover stories, religious justifications for experimental medical practices that could be used to deflect charges of heresy. These cover stories are based on legitimate theological principles about the duty to preserve life and the use of natural remedies that God has provided. By framing their experimental work as fulfilling religious obligations rather than challenging church authority, guild members can sometimes gain protection from sympathetic clergy. Dr. Apprentice has memorized several such cover stories, and he begins testing them with Brother Thomas during their discussions of medical practice. I've been wondering, he says, whether the use of alchemical preparations might be justified as a way of purifying God's natural remedies to make them more effective. This is a carefully crafted question that presents alchemical medicine as an enhancement of divine creation rather than a challenge to it. Brother Thomas's response will indicate whether he's receptive to this kind of theological reasoning. That's an interesting perspective, Brother Thomas replies thoughtfully. The alchemists do claim to be purifying and perfecting natural substances, rather than creating artificial ones. And if the results help patients, then perhaps the techniques are divinely inspired. This response suggests that Brother Thomas is indeed open to experimental approaches, provided they can be justified within acceptable theological frameworks. Over the following days, Dr. Apprentice gradually reveals more about guild research, methods and findings, always framing them in terms that emphasize their consistency with religious principles. He describes the guild's systematic documentation as bearing witness to God's healing power and presents their experimental treatments as seeking to understand the divine plan for human health. Brother Thomas becomes increasingly interested in guild activities, particularly their approaches to documenting treatment outcomes and sharing knowledge between physicians. The monastery's medical practices, while advanced for their time, have been developed in isolation. The possibility of collaborating with physicians in other cities is appealing. We've developed several innovations that seem to help our patients, Brother Thomas admits. But we have no way of knowing whether they would work in other locations or with different patient populations. This is exactly the kind of validation problem that the Guild's network is designed to solve. Dr. Apprentice explains how Guild members test treatments across multiple cities and patient populations, providing the kind of evidence that individual practitioners can't generate on their own. The conversation reaches a crucial point when Brother Thomas asks directly about Guild membership requirements and security protocols. If we were to collaborate with your organization, he says, what would be expected of us? And what protections would we have if church authorities became suspicious? Dr. Apprentice explains the Guild's approach to clerical recruitment. Monastery physicians can participate in Guild research without formal membership, sharing information and receiving research findings while maintaining their primary loyalty. to their religious communities. We're not asking you to choose between the guild and the church, he explains. We're offering you the opportunity to serve both by advancing medical knowledge in ways that save lives and honor God. This approach allows sympathetic clergy to support guild activities without compromising their religious commitments or putting themselves at unnecessary risk. Historians still argue whether the guild's recruitment of monastery physicians represented genuine religious conviction or simply pragmatic alliance building. The evidence suggests it was probably both guild members were generally devout Christians who saw their medical work as a form of religious service, while also recognizing the practical benefits of having allies within church institutions. Brother Thomas agrees to a trial collaboration, beginning with the sharing of treatment outcome data and the testing of selected guild protocols within the monastery's patient population. This arrangement provides the guild with access to a new research site, while giving the monastery access to advanced medical knowledge. But the most significant aspect of this collaboration isn't the immediate research benefits, it's the precedent. It establishes for guild relationships with religious institutions. If the collaboration with San Lorenzo proves successful, it could serve as a model for similar arrangements with monasteries throughout Europe. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval monasteries were centers of medical learning and practice. What's less well known is that some monastic physicians were actively involved in medical innovation and research, often working in informal collaboration with secular physicians. Dr. Apprentice's successful recruitment of Brother Thomas represents a major strategic victory for the guild. It provides them with a secure research facility, access to extensive medical libraries, and the protection that comes from having allies within the church hierarchy. But it also creates new risks and responsibilities. The guild must now ensure that their collaboration with San Lorenzo doesn't compromise the monastery's religious mission or expose the monks to persecution by church authorities. This requires the development of new security protocols specifically designed for clerical collaborators. The guild creates special communication procedures that can be disguised as routine religious correspondence, develops cover stories that frame research activities as spiritual exercises, and establishes emergency procedures for protecting monastery collaborators if guild activities are discovered. The collaboration begins with a joint research project, a systematic study of prayer and meditation as medical treatments for plague patients. This project allows the guild to test their theories about psychological factors in healing while providing the monastery with a research framework that's completely consistent with religious practice. We've observed that patients who maintain hope and spiritual comfort seem to recover more often than those who despair, Brother Thomas notes. But we've never tried to document this systematically. This observation aligns perfectly with guild theories about the importance of psychological factors in medical treatment. The collaboration will allow both organizations to test these theories using rigorous methodology while maintaining complete theological orthodoxy. You're now deep in the monastery's scriptorium, where Brother Thomas and Dr. Apprentice are working by candlelight to develop what might be the most revolutionary medical document of the medieval period. a treatment manual that seamlessly integrates guild experimental methods with orthodox religious practice. The document they're creating looks like a conventional religious text about the spiritual care of the sick, but embedded within the theological discussions are detailed medical protocols that represent the cutting edge of 14th century therapeutic innovation. Chapter 3 on the spiritual purification of corrupted humors reads one section heading. But beneath this religious language lies a sophisticated discussion of guild techniques for treating plague, symptoms using alchemical preparations, and carefully timed interventions. This integration of medical and religious content serves multiple purposes. It provides theological justification for experimental treatments, creates a distribution mechanism that can reach physicians throughout the Christian world, and establishes a framework for future collaboration between guild researchers and religious institutions. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval medical texts were often written in Latin and distributed through monastery networks. What's less well known is that some of these texts contained encoded information about experimental treatments and research findings that couldn't be openly discussed. Brother Thomas brings a unique perspective to this collaboration. His theological training allows him to frame guild discoveries in language that will be acceptable to church authorities, while his medical experience helps him identify which experimental treatments are most likely to be effective and safe. The key, he explains to Dr. Apprentice, is to present innovation as the restoration of ancient wisdom rather than the development of new knowledge. The church is much more comfortable with rediscovering God's truth than with creating human innovations. This insight leads to a brilliant strategy, presenting guild discoveries as the recovery of medical knowledge that was known to early Christian physicians, but lost during periods of social upheaval. By framing experimental treatments as traditional practices that are being restored, rather than revolutionary innovations that are being invented, they can avoid charges of heresy while still advancing medical practice. The quirky detail that medical historians find most fascinating is the guild's development of scriptural justification protocols, systematic methods for finding biblical passages that could be interpreted as supporting specific medical treatments. These protocols aren't just theological window dressing, they represent a sophisticated understanding of how religious and medical authority intersect in medieval society. By grounding their experimental work in scriptural authority, guild members can claim divine sanction for their innovations. Dr. Apprentice demonstrates this approach by showing Brother Thomas how mercury vapor therapy can be justified through references to biblical passages about purification and healing. The prophet Malachi speaks of God as a refiner's fire who purifies silver. He notes, mercury is the most perfect of metals, and vapor therapy uses fire to release its purifying essence. This kind of theological reasoning sounds forced to modern ears, but it was completely legitimate according to medieval interpretive methods. The ability to find scriptural support for medical practices was considered evidence of their divine approval. Brother Thomas contributes his own theological insights, showing how guild documentation methods can be presented as forms of religious witness. The careful recording of God's healing works is itself a form of prayer, he argues. By documenting treatment outcomes, we're bearing testimony to divine mercy and power. This reframing transforms Guild research protocols from potentially heretical experimental practices into orthodox religious exercises. It's a brilliant solution to the problem of conducting systematic medical research within a society that's suspicious of innovation. The document they're creating will serve as a template for similar collaborations throughout Europe. If successful, it could allow Guild members to work openly with religious institutions, dramatically expanding their research capabilities while providing protection from persecution. But the most ambitious aspect of their collaboration isn't the immediate research benefits. It's the long-term vision of transforming medical education throughout the Christian world. Imagine, Brother Thomas says, his eyes bright with possibility, if every monastery hospital in Europe were conducting systematic medical research, sharing findings through existing church communication networks, and training physicians according to improved protocols. This vision represents nothing less than the creation of a continent-wide medical research network, operating under religious auspices, but guided by Guild principles of empirical observation and systematic experimentation. Dr. Apprentice is equally excited by the possibilities. We could establish research priorities that address the most pressing medical needs, coordinate multi-center studies, and provide definitive evidence about treatment effectiveness, and ensure that medical advances reach even the most remote communities. The conversation turns to practical implementation strategies. How can they convince other monasteries to adopt their approach? What incentives can they offer to encourage participation? How can they ensure quality control and maintain research standards across a geographically dispersed network? They develop a plan that combines religious motivation with practical benefits. Monasteries that participate in the research network will gain access to advanced medical knowledge, improved treatment outcomes for their patients, an enhanced reputation as centers of healing excellence. The plan also includes provisions for training and support. Experienced Guild members will travel between monasteries as medical missionaries, providing training in research methods and helping to establish local research capabilities. We'll present this as a revival of the early Christian tradition of medical ministry, Brother Thomas suggests. The apostles were healers as well as preachers, and many early saints were known for their medical knowledge. This historical framing provides powerful justification for the integration of systematic medical research with religious practice. It's not innovation, it's restoration of authentic Christian tradition. Historians still argue whether the Guild's collaboration with religious institutions represented genuine spiritual conviction or simply strategic alliance building. The evidence suggests that many Guild members were sincerely devout and saw their medical work as a form of religious service. The document they're creating includes detailed protocols for maintaining both medical and spiritual standards. Research activities must be conducted in ways that support rather than compromise the religious mission of participating institutions. Medical research should enhance rather than replace traditional spiritual care, reads one section. Physicians must remember that they are instruments of divine healing, not independent agents of cure. This integration of medical and spiritual approaches reflects a holistic understanding of health and healing that's remarkably sophisticated for the medieval period. As dawn approaches, Dr. Apprentice and Brother Thomas complete the first draft of their revolutionary document. It represents months of careful work to balance medical innovation with religious orthodoxy, creating a framework that could transform medical practice throughout Europe. But they also recognize that their work is just beginning. The real test will come when they attempt to implement their vision, convincing other monasteries to adopt their approach and demonstrating that systematic medical research can coexist with orthodox religious practice. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval monasteries played a crucial role in preserving and transmitting medical knowledge. What's less well known is that some monastic physicians were actively involved in developing new medical knowledge through systematic research and experimentation. The collaboration between Dr. Apprentice and Brother Thomas represents a turning point in guild history, the moment when the organization begins to emerge from complete secrecy and seek legitimate institutional support for its research activities. This transition from underground resistance to semi-legitimate collaboration reflects the guild's growing confidence in their methods and the recognition that larger-scale research requires institutional support that can only be provided by established organizations like monasteries. It also creates new challenges and risks. The guild must now balance their commitment to medical innovation with the need to maintain relationships with religious authorities, who may not share their enthusiasm for experimental approaches. Asterisk, you're now witnessing the first test of the guild's new collaboration strategy as Brother Thomas presents their joint research proposal to the abbot of San Lorenzo. This meeting will determine whether their vision of religiously sanctioned medical research can become reality, or whether it will be rejected as dangerous innovation disguised as orthodox practice. The abbot, a scholarly man in his 60s, who has spent decades balancing religious orthodoxy with practical necessities, listens carefully as Brother Thomas explains their proposal. He's particularly interested in the theological justifications for systematic medical research and the potential benefits for the monastery's reputation as a center of healing. You're proposing that we document our medical practices more systematically. The abbot summarizes, and share our findings with other religious institutions for the greater glory of God and the benefit of suffering humanity. Brother Thomas nods, carefully emphasizing the religious motivations while downplaying the experimental aspects. We believe that careful observation of God's healing works will enhance our ability to serve as instruments of divine mercy. This framing is crucial because it presents medical research as a form of religious devotion rather than secular investigation. The abbot is much more likely to approve activities that enhance the monastery's spiritual mission than those that seem to prioritize worldly knowledge. The abbot asks probing questions about the proposed research methods, particularly the documentation, protocols, and communication procedures. He's clearly concerned about maintaining the monastery's reputation for orthodoxy while allowing for medical innovation. These observation methods you describe, he says, they won't involve anything that could be construed as magical or heretical practices? Brother Thomas has prepared for this question. All of our methods are based on careful observation of natural processes and the documentation of God's healing works. We're not creating anything artificial. We're simply paying closer attention to the divine interventions that occur naturally in our hospital. This answer satisfies the abbot's immediate concerns, but he raises a more fundamental question about the monastery's relationship with secular physicians like Dr. Apprentice. What assurances do we have that these outside collaborators share our religious commitments? How do we know they won't lead us into practices that compromise our spiritual mission? This is the crucial test of Dr. Apprentice's cover story and the Guild's theological justifications. Brother Thomas responds by emphasizing Dr. Apprentice's demonstrated piety and his commitment to framing medical work as religious service. Brother Apprentice has shown himself to be a devout Christian who sees medical practice as a form of ministry, Brother Thomas explains. His approach to healing is entirely consistent with our religious values. The use of Brother Apprentice is significant. It suggests that Dr. Apprentice is being treated as an honorary member of the religious community rather than an outside, secular consultant. The abbot considers this carefully before asking to speak with Dr. Apprentice directly. This is the moment when the Guild's theological cover stories will face their most serious test. Dr. Apprentice enters. The abbot study with the demeanor of a devout physician seeking to serve God through healing. Ministry. He's prepared for this conversation through months of studying religious texts and practicing theological arguments for medical innovation. I understand you're interested in collaborating with our medical ministry, the abbot begins. Can you explain why a secular physician would want to work within a religious framework? Dr. Apprentice's response draws on genuine religious conviction as well as strategic considerations. I've come to understand that healing is fundamentally a spiritual as well as physical process, he says. The most effective medical practice requires attention to the patient's soul as well as their body. This answer reflects both Guild theories about psychological factors in healing and authentic medieval Christian beliefs about the integration of spiritual and physical health. The abbot probes deeper, asking about Dr. Apprentice's views on the relationship between natural philosophy and religious faith. This is dangerous territory because it touches on fundamental questions about the authority of reason versus revelation. I believe that careful study of God's creation can enhance our understanding of divine wisdom, Dr. Apprentice responds. Medical observation is a form of natural theology. It reveals God's design for human health and healing. This answer successfully frames medical research as a form of religious study rather than secular investigation. It's a sophisticated theological argument that presents empirical observation as a way of understanding divine truth. The quirky detail that historians find most interesting is the Guild's development of conversion narratives, personal stories, that explain how secular physicians came to see medical practice as religious vocation. These narratives serve multiple purposes. They provide cover stories for Guild members working in religious contexts they offer genuine spiritual frameworks for understanding medical work, and they help bridge the gap between secular and religious approaches to healing. Dr. Apprentice's conversion narrative emphasizes his growing recognition that effective healing requires attention to spiritual as well as physical factors. I began to notice that patients who maintained faith and hope recovered more often than those who despaired, he explains. This led me to understand that medical practice must address the whole person, not just their physical symptoms. This story is both strategically useful and personally authentic. Many Guild members have indeed observed the importance of psychological factors in healing, and their medical work has led them to deeper appreciation of the spiritual dimensions of health and illness. The Abbot is clearly impressed by Dr. Apprentice's theological sophistication and apparent sincerity. But he raises one final concern about the practical implications of the proposed collaboration. If we agree to this partnership, he asks, what safeguards will ensure that our monastery's reputation for orthodoxy is protected? We cannot afford to be associated with anything that might be construed as heretical. This question goes to the heart of the Guild's challenge in transitioning from underground resistance to legitimate institutional collaboration. They need to provide convincing assurances that their research activities won't compromise their religious partners. Brother Thomas and Dr. Apprentice have prepared a comprehensive response to this concern. They propose a system of oversight that includes regular review of research activities by senior monastery officials, clear protocols for discontinuing any practices that raise theological concerns, and careful documentation that demonstrates the religious motivations for all research activities. We're not asking for carte blanche to conduct any kind of investigation, Brother Thomas explains. We're proposing a carefully supervised program of medical observation that operates within clearly defined religious parameters. The Abbot considers their proposal for several long minutes before rendering his decision. I'm willing to approve a trial period of 6 months, he announces. If your collaborative research proves beneficial to our patients and consistent with our religious mission, we can consider expanding the program. This conditional approval represents a major victory for the Guild's new strategy. It provides them with their first legitimate institutional base for medical research, while establishing a precedent that could be replicated at other monasteries. But it also creates new pressures and responsibilities. The Guild must now prove that their research methods can produce genuine benefits while operating within the constraints of religious orthodoxy. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval monasteries were often centers of medical innovation and learning. What's less well known is that some monastic institutions actively collaborated with secular physicians in developing new approaches to medical research and practice. The approval of their collaboration marks the beginning of a new phase in Guild history that transitioned from pure underground resistance to semi-legitimate institutional partnership. This evolution reflects both the Guild's growing confidence in their methods and their recognition that larger-scale medical research requires institutional support, but it also represents a fundamental shift in the organization's character. The Guild must now balance their commitment to medical innovation with the need to maintain relationships with religious authorities, who may not share their enthusiasm for experimental approaches. Asterisk, you're now observing the first formal guild research. Project conducted under religious auspices as Brother Thomas and Dr. Apprentice begin their systematic study of prayer and meditation as medical treatments for plague patients. This isn't just a cover story for other research activities. It's a genuine investigation of psychological factors in healing that could revolutionize medical understanding. The study design is remarkably sophisticated for the 14th century. They've divided the monastery's plague patients into 3 groups: those receiving standard medical care, plus intensive spiritual counseling; those receiving standard care, plus basic religious services; and those receiving only standard medical care. This represents one of the first controlled clinical trials in European medical history, conducted using methodology that wouldn't be out of place in a modern research hospital. The key, Brother Thomas explains to Dr. Apprentice, is ensuring that all patients receive the same medical treatments, so that any differences in outcomes can be attributed to the spiritual interventions. This understanding of experimental controls demonstrates remarkable sophistication in research design. They're isolating variables in ways that allow them to draw meaningful conclusions about the effectiveness of their interventions. Spiritual interventions themselves are carefully standardized. Patients in the intensive counseling group receive daily visits from trained monks who provide prayer, meditation guidance, and emotional support. The basic services group participates in regular religious observances, but doesn't receive individual spiritual counseling. The control group receives medical care without specific religious interventions. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval medicine recognized the importance of spiritual factors in healing. What's less well known is that some medieval physicians developed systematic methods for studying these factors using controlled, experimental designs. Dr. Apprentice is responsible for documenting medical outcomes, while Brother Thomas tracks spiritual and psychological factors. They're using standardized assessment protocols that allow them to compare results across different patient groups. The medical assessments include detailed tracking of symptom progression, treatment response, and survival rates, but they also include more subjective measures like pain levels, sleep quality, and general sense of well-being. The spiritual assessments are equally systematic. Brother Thomas has developed scales for measuring hope, faith, acceptance of illness, and spiritual comfort. These aren't just impressionistic observations. They're quantified assessments that can be statistically analyzed. Patient 23 shows high levels of spiritual comfort and acceptance. Brother Thomas notes in his records, pain reports have decreased significantly since beginning intensive counseling, despite no changes in medical treatment. This kind of detailed documentation allows them to identify patterns that might not be apparent from casual observation. They're building a database that could provide definitive evidence about the medical benefits of spiritual care. The quirky detail that historians find most fascinating is the guild's development of prayer protocols, standardized spiritual interventions that can be replicated across different religious institutions. These protocols specify not just the content of prayers and meditations, but also their timing, duration, and delivery methods. It's essentially the systematization of spiritual care, applying scientific methodology to religious practice. The prayer protocols include specific interventions for different stages of illness. Prayers for comfort during acute symptoms, meditations for maintaining hope during recovery, and spiritual counseling for patients facing death. For patients in the crisis phase, reads one protocol, provide prayers emphasizing God's mercy and the possibility of healing, combined with meditation. Exercises that promote relaxation and reduce anxiety. These protocols allow the study to be replicated at other monasteries, providing the kind of multi-center validation that the Guild values for all of their research. After 3 months of data collection, the results are becoming clear. Patients receiving intensive spiritual counseling are showing significantly better outcomes than those in the other groups. They're surviving longer, reporting less pain, and maintaining better psychological states throughout their illness. But the most surprising finding is that the spiritual interventions seem to enhance the effectiveness of medical treatments. Patients receiving both intensive counseling and standard medical care are responding better to conventional therapies than those receiving medical care alone. It's as if the spiritual support is somehow amplifying the body's natural healing mechanisms. Dr. Apprentice observes, reviewing the data with Brother Thomas. This observation anticipates modern understanding of psychoneuroimmunology, the study of how psychological factors affect immune function and healing processes. While they lack the theoretical framework to fully understand what they're observing, their empirical findings are pointing toward fundamental principles that won't be formally recognized for centuries. The results are so compelling that the abbot agrees to extend the study and expand it to include other types of patients. The monastery's success with spiritual medical integration is attracting attention from other religious institutions, creating opportunities for the Guild to replicate their approach elsewhere. Brother Thomas begins corresponding with monastery physicians throughout Europe, sharing their research protocols and encouraging similar studies. This creates the foundation for the continent-wide research network that he and Dr. Apprentice envisioned. But the success of their collaboration also creates new challenges. As word spreads about the monastery's innovative approaches to medical care, they begin attracting attention from church authorities who are less sympathetic to medical innovation. A delegation of senior clergy arrives from Rome to investigate reports of unusual healing practices at San Lorenzo. This inspection could either validate their approach and provide official church approval, or it could result in condemnation and persecution. Dr. Apprentice and Brother Thomas spend days preparing for the inspection, ensuring that all of their research activities can be presented in ways that emphasize religious rather than secular motivations. We're not conducting medical experiments, Brother Thomas coaches Dr. Apprentice. We're documenting God's healing works and seeking to understand how spiritual care can enhance divine intervention in human illness. This reframing is crucial because it presents their systematic research as religious devotion rather than secular investigation. The inspection itself is conducted by Cardinal Benedetti, a scholar administrator who has spent years balancing church doctrine with practical necessities. He's particularly interested in the theological justifications for systematic medical observation and the integration of spiritual care with conventional treatment. You claim that careful documentation of healing outcomes serves religious purposes. The Cardinal observes, "Can you explain how record-keeping constitutes a form of spiritual practice?" Brother Thomas responds with a sophisticated theological argument that presents medical documentation as a form of testimony to divine power. By carefully recording God's healing works, we're bearing witness to divine mercy and creating a permanent record of miraculous interventions. This argument successfully frames research activities as religious exercises rather than secular investigations. The Cardinal also questions Dr. Apprentice about his motivations for working within a religious framework rather than pursuing independent medical practice. "I've come to understand that healing is fundamentally a spiritual process," Dr. Apprentice responds. "The most effective medical practice requires partnership with divine power rather than reliance on human knowledge alone." This answer demonstrates both theological sophistication and genuine spiritual conviction, satisfying the Cardinal's concerns about secular physicians working in religious contexts. Historians still argue whether the Guild's integration with religious institutions represented genuine spiritual evolution or simply strategic adaptation to political realities. The evidence suggests it was probably both. Many Guild members developed authentic religious convictions, while also recognizing the practical benefits of institutional protection. After 3 days of investigation, Cardinal Benedetti renders his verdict. The work being conducted at San Lorenzo represents an exemplary integration of medical practice with spiritual ministry, he announces. "I recommend that other monasteries adopt similar approaches to caring for the sick." This official approval represents a major triumph for the Guild's new strategy. It provides them with legitimate church sanction for their research activities, while establishing a precedent that could be replicated throughout Europe. But more importantly, it validates their vision of systematic medical research conducted within religious frameworks. They've proven that empirical investigation and spiritual practice can coexist and even enhance each other. Asterisk, you're now witnessing the culmination of the Guild's transformation as representatives from 12 major monasteries gather at San Lorenzo for the first European Conference on Medical Ministry. This isn't just a meeting of like-minded physicians. It's the formal establishment of a continent-wide network for systematic medical research operating under religious auspices. The conference brings together monastery physicians, Guild members, and church officials from across Europe to share research findings, establish common protocols, and plan coordinated studies that could revolutionize medical practice throughout the Christian world. Brother Thomas opens the conference with a presentation that would be recognizable to any modern medical researcher. A systematic review of evidence about spiritual factors in healing, complete with statistical analysis and recommendations for clinical practice. Our data from San Lorenzo demonstrates that patients receiving integrated spiritual medical care show 34% better survival rates than those receiving medical care alone. He reports, displaying charts that track outcomes across different patient populations. This kind of evidence-based presentation represents a fundamental shift in how medical knowledge is communicated and validated. Instead of relying on authority and tradition, the conference participants are sharing empirical data and subjecting their findings to peer review. Dr. Apprentice follows with a presentation on the Guild's systematic approach to treatment documentation, showing how standardized protocols can ensure consistent data collection across multiple research sites. The key to reliable results, he explains, is ensuring that all participating institutions use identical methods for patient assessment, treatment delivery, and outcome measurement. This emphasis on methodological standardization reflects the Guild's understanding that meaningful research requires careful attention to experimental design and data quality. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval medical conferences were primarily focused on discussing ancient texts and established authorities. What's less well known is that some medieval medical gatherings, particularly those organized during crisis periods, emphasized the sharing of empirical observations and research findings. The conference participants represent the most advanced medical thinkers of their time, but they're working within the constraints of 14th century knowledge and technology. Their discussions blend sophisticated research methodology with theoretical frameworks that modern science has abandoned. Brother Augustine from the monastery of Cluny presents findings from his study of herbal treatments for plague symptoms. His research design includes controlled comparisons between different plant preparations, systematic documentation of dosage effects, and careful tracking of side effects and contraindications. We found that willow bark extract is most effective when administered in combination with honey and warm wine, he reports, but only for patients in the early stages of infection. Later stage patients show better response to foxglove preparations. This kind of detailed pharmacological observation represents genuine medical progress, even though the theoretical explanations are based on humoral theory rather than modern. Biochemistry. Dr. Nightshade, traveling under the cover identity of Sister Lucia, presents the Guild's most ambitious research project, a multi-center study of plague transmission patterns that involves data collection from 15 cities across Europe. Our findings suggest that the disease spreads through specific pathways that can be predicted and potentially interrupted, she explains, showing maps that track plague progression across trade routes and population centers. This epidemiological research represents one of the first systematic attempts to understand disease transmission on a continental scale. The data they've collected could be invaluable for predicting and preventing future outbreaks. The quirky detail that historians find most fascinating is the conference's development of research liturgy, formal prayers, and religious ceremonies, designed to sanctify medical research activities and ensure divine blessing for experimental work. These liturgical elements aren't just window dressing. They represent a genuine attempt to integrate scientific methodology with religious practice, creating a framework where empirical investigation can coexist with spiritual devotion. The research liturgy includes specific prayers for different phases of medical investigation, prayers for wisdom during study design, prayers for accuracy during data collection, prayers for insight during analysis, and prayers for humility when interpreting results. Grant us, O Lord, the wisdom to observe your healing works with clarity and precision. Reads one prayer, that we might better serve as instruments of your mercy for those who suffer. This integration of religious and scientific language reflects the conference participants' understanding that their research activities are forms of religious service rather than secular investigation. The conference also addresses practical challenges of maintaining research quality and security across a geographically dispersed network. They develop standardized communication protocols, establish procedures for sharing sensitive information, and create oversight mechanisms to ensure that research activities remain consistent with religious missions. Brother Thomas presents a comprehensive plan for training new researcher physicians who can establish additional research centers throughout Europe. This training program combines traditional medical education with field research methodology and religious formation. We need physicians who are competent in medical practice, skilled in research methods, and committed to serving God through healing ministry, he explains. This requires a new model of medical education that integrates all three elements. The training program they design is remarkably comprehensive, requiring 3 years of study that includes medical theory, practical clinical experience, research methodology, and theological formation. Graduates would be qualified to establish research programs at any monastery or religious institution. But the conference's most significant achievement is the formal establishment of the network of medical ministry, a continent-wide organization that will coordinate research activities, share findings, and provide mutual support for member institutions. Network operates under the authority of participating monasteries, but follows research protocols developed by guild members. It represents the successful integration of systematic medical research with legitimate religious institutions. Cardinal Benedetti, who has remained at San Lorenzo to observe the conference, provides official church approval for the network's activities. This organization represents the finest tradition of Christian healing ministry, he announces. I encourage all religious institutions to consider participation in this noble work. This endorsement provides the network with powerful protection from potential persecution, while establishing a precedent for church support of systematic medical research. The conference concludes with the adoption of a formal charter that establishes the network's mission, governance structure, and research priorities. The charter represents a remarkable synthesis of guild principles with religious values, creating a framework for medical innovation that operates within acceptable institutional boundaries. We pledge ourselves to the advancement of medical knowledge for the glory of God and the relief of human suffering, reads the Charter's preamble. Through careful observation of divine healing works and systematic sharing of our findings, we seek to become more effective instruments of heavenly mercy. This language successfully frames medical research as religious devotion, while establishing clear commitments to empirical methodology and knowledge sharing. The network's research priorities reflect both immediate medical needs and long-term scientific goals. They plan coordinated studies of plague treatment and prevention, systematic investigations of other common diseases, and basic research into the fundamental principles of health and healing. But perhaps most importantly, they establish procedures for preserving and transmitting their research findings to future generations of physicians. The network will maintain comprehensive libraries of medical knowledge, train new researchers according to standardized protocols, and ensure that their discoveries survive even if individual institutions are disrupted. Historians still argue whether the network of medical ministry represented genuine medical progress or simply a more sophisticated form of medieval traditionalism. The evidence suggests it was both real advances in research methodology and clinical practice, operating within theoretical frameworks that we now know to be incorrect. The conference participants recognize that they're creating something unprecedented in European medical history, a systematic, coordinated approach to medical research that operates on a continental scale. They understand that their work could transform medical practice throughout the Christian world. But they also recognize the fragility of their achievement. The network depends on continued church support, political stability, and the willingness of individual institutions to prioritize research activities despite competing demands. Dr. Apprentice, reflecting on the conference's achievements, captures both the excitement and the uncertainty of their situation. We've created something remarkable here, but its survival depends on factors beyond our control. All we can do is conduct the best research possible and hope that our discoveries prove valuable enough to ensure the network's continuation. This recognition of both opportunity and vulnerability reflects the complex position of medical innovators, working within institutional constraints. They've achieved more than they initially thought possible, but they remain dependent on external support that could be withdrawn at any time. Asterisk. You're now following the network's first coordinated research mission as teams of physician researchers spread across Europe to establish new research centers and implement standardized protocols for studying the plague's final phases. The Black Death is beginning to wane in some regions, but its effects will reshape European society for generations to come. Dr. Apprentice leads a team to establish a research center in Prague, where the plague's retreat has left behind a population eager for medical innovations that might prevent future outbreaks. The city's authorities, having witnessed the devastation that conventional medicine couldn't prevent, are surprisingly receptive to experimental approaches. The Prague Center represents the network's most ambitious expansion, yet a fully integrated research facility that combines monastery hospital services with systematic medical investigation. It's designed to serve as a model for similar centers throughout Central Europe. But establishing the center requires navigating complex political and religious dynamics. Prague sits at the intersection of various European power structures, and any medical innovation must be acceptable to multiple authorities with potentially conflicting interests. Dr. Apprentice's first challenge is building relationships with local physicians who may view the network's methods as threats to their established practices. He begins by offering to share guild knowledge freely, demonstrating that the network's goal is collaboration rather than competition. We're not here to replace existing medical practices, he explains to a gathering of Prague physicians. We're here to enhance them through systematic research and knowledge sharing. This collaborative approach proves effective. Local physicians are impressed by the network's treatment outcomes and eager to learn methods that could improve their own practice. The mainstream historical fact is that the Black Death killed approximately 1/3 of Europe's population between 1347 and 1351. What's less well known is that the pandemic's aftermath created unprecedented opportunities for medical innovation. As traditional authorities were discredited and new approaches gained acceptance, the Prague Center's research focuses on understanding the long-term effects of plague survival and developing treatments for the chronic health problems that many survivors experience. This represents a shift from acute crisis management to comprehensive health care that addresses the ongoing consequences of epidemic disease. Dr. Apprentice and his team document a range of post-plague health issues: persistent fatigue, recurring fevers, joint pain, and psychological symptoms that we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. They develop treatment protocols that combine physical remedies with psychological support. Plague survivors often experience a form of melancholy that conventional treatments cannot address. Dr. Apprentice notes in his research logs. They require specialized interventions that acknowledge both the physical and spiritual trauma of their experience. This recognition of psychological factors in recovery represents advanced thinking for the 14th century. The network's integrated approach to physical and mental health anticipates modern understanding of trauma and recovery. The quirky detail that historians find most interesting is the network's development of survivor support groups, organized gatherings where plague survivors can share their experiences and provide mutual emotional support. These support groups aren't just informal social gatherings. They're structured therapeutic interventions based on the network's observations that survivors recover more effectively when they can process their experiences with others who have had similar traumas. Patients who participate in survivor gatherings show faster recovery from post-plague melancholy. Brother Marcus, the Prague Center's spiritual director, reports, the sharing of experiences seems to reduce the isolation and despair that often follow survival. This insight anticipates modern understanding of peer support and group therapy as effective treatments for trauma-related psychological problems. The Prague Center also serves as a training facility for the network's expanding educational program. Physicians from across Central Europe come to study the network's research methods and treatment protocols, then return to their home communities to establish similar programs. This educational mission represents the network's long-term strategy for transforming European medical practice. Rather than trying to directly control medical care throughout the continent, they're training local physicians who can implement network methods within their own cultural and institutional contexts. Training program has evolved considerably since the early guild days. It now includes formal coursework in research methodology, clinical practice, and medical ethics, combined with supervised practical experience in patient care and research activities. A network physician must be competent in 3 areas, Doctor. Apprentice explains to a new class of trainees. Clinical skills for treating individual patients, research skills for advancing medical knowledge, and ethical reasoning for making difficult decisions about experimental treatments. This comprehensive approach to medical education represents a significant advance over traditional medieval training, which focused primarily on memorizing ancient texts and learning from individual masters. But the network's most significant achievement in Prague is the establishment of the first European medical library, dedicated specifically to research findings rather than classical authorities. This library contains detailed records of treatment outcomes, experimental protocols, and research findings from network centers throughout Europe. The library represents a fundamental shift in how medical knowledge is organized and transmitted. Instead of relying on ancient authorities and traditional practices, it emphasizes empirical observations and systematic research findings. This library contains the collective medical experience of dozens of physicians treating thousands of patients. Dr. Apprentice tells visitors, it represents the most comprehensive collection of practical medical knowledge in European history. The library's organization reflects the network's systematic approach to knowledge management. Research findings are cataloged according to disease type, treatment method, patient population, and research quality, allowing physicians to quickly locate relevant information for specific clinical situations. But the library also serves a symbolic function, representing the network's commitment to preserving and transmitting medical knowledge for future generations. It's designed to survive political upheavals, religious conflicts, and other disruptions that might threaten individual research centers. As the plague continues to recede across Europe, the network faces new challenges and opportunities. The immediate crisis that drove their formation is ending, but the research infrastructure they've created could address a wide range of medical problems beyond plague treatment. Dr. Apprentice and his colleagues began planning research programs focused on other common diseases: tuberculosis, dysentery, various fevers, and the chronic conditions that affect medieval populations. They're transforming from a crisis response organization into a permanent institution for medical research and education. This transition requires careful attention to sustainability and institutional relationships. The network must demonstrate continued value to its religious and political sponsors, while adapting to changing medical needs and social conditions. The Prague Center becomes a testing ground for this transition, developing research programs that address ongoing health concerns, while maintaining the collaborative relationships that enabled their initial success. Brother Marcus observes that their work has evolved beyond crisis, response to something approaching modern public health. We're no longer just treating individual patients. We're trying to understand and improve the health of entire communities. This population-level perspective represents advanced thinking for the medieval period, anticipating modern approaches to epidemiology and public health that won't be formally developed for centuries. As you observe the network's activities in Prague, you're witnessing the transformation of medieval medicine from a collection of individual practices into a systematic, research-based discipline. The plague doctor's secret nightlife has evolved into a legitimate, institutionally supported program of medical innovation. The journey from Dr. Malpractice's desperate nighttime experiments to the network's comprehensive research programs represents one of the most remarkable transformations in medical history. What began as underground resistance to medical orthodoxy has become a new model for systematic medical research and education. But perhaps most importantly, the network has demonstrated that medical innovation can coexist with traditional institutions when it's presented in ways that support rather than threaten established values and authorities. The plague doctor's legacy isn't just the specific treatments they developed or the lives they saved during the Black Death. It's the model they created for systematic medical research, collaborative knowledge sharing, and the integration of empirical observation with institutional support. As the sun sets over Prague and the network's physicians continue their rounds, you're witnessing the quiet revolution that transformed European medicine. The secret nightlife of plague doctors has become the foundation for a new era of medical progress, one that will continue long after the last plague victim has recovered, and the iconic beak masks have been stored away in monastery archives. Network success demonstrates that even in the darkest periods of human history, dedicated individuals can create institutions that advance knowledge, improve human welfare, and provide hope for future generations. The plague doctor's courage in facing the unknown has created tools and methods that will serve physicians for centuries to come. Their story reminds us that medical progress often emerges from crisis. That innovation requires both individual courage and institutional support, and that the most important discoveries sometimes come from those who are willing to work in the shadows, asking dangerous questions and seeking better answers to humanity's oldest problems. And now, as the candles burn low in the Prague Research Center, and the last entries are made in the day's research logs, you can rest knowing that the secret nightlife of plague doctors has illuminated pathways that will guide medical practice for generations yet to come. Their legacy lives on in every systematic clinical trial, every evidence-based treatment protocol, and every physician who approaches medicine as both art and science, combining compassionate care with rigorous investigation. Sleep well, knowing that even in humanity's darkest hours, there are always those who choose to light candles rather than curse the darkness, who face the unknown with courage and curiosity, and who work tirelessly to transform today's mysteries into tomorrow's healing knowledge.